Oh, stumbling upon this quiet refuge is no accident. Perhaps the Force guided your steps here. Follow me, sit beside the fire, and take some rest. There's a long road ahead of you among the stars, so feel free to ease your mind and listen to my tales. Tonight, we drift far back, long before the Republic, long before the Sith and the Jedi you know. We go to a green world in the deep core, called Tython, where mysterious pyramid ships gathered the first Force sensitives from across the galaxy. There, an order of warriors and scholars was born, seekers of balance who named themselves the Jedi. Let us begin at the very dawn. Our story begins on a world called Tython, a green planet buried deep within the heart of the galaxy, in a region known as the Deep Core. Getting there was a trial in itself, for the Deep Core churned with dense clusters of stars, gravity wells, and radiation storms that swallowed ships whole. Few vessels could thread those crowded lanes and survive, which left Tython hidden away for untold ages, a secret kept by the very violence of the space surrounding it. Yet those who did reach it found a world of forests and grasslands, of rolling hills and deep oceans, a place lush with life and warm beneath its sun. Tython was a beautiful world, though it carried a temperament all its own. The planet brimmed with the Force, to a degree found almost nowhere else in the galaxy. Every stone, every river, every living thing there hummed with that unseen energy, and the world responded to shifts in that energy the way a calm sea responds to a gathering wind. When the Force fell out of harmony, Tython answered. Groundquakes rolled across the continents, the skies darkened, and great tempests of raw energy called Force storms swept over the land, tearing apart anything caught beneath them. In this way, the planet served as both cradle and judge, nurturing those who lived in balance and punishing those who strayed from it. 2 moons hung above this restless world, and they would come to shape everything that followed. The first was Ashla, pale and bright, a gentle light in the night sky. The second was Bogan, darker and heavier, a brooding presence against the stars. Night after night, the 2 moons crossed the heavens together, one luminous and one shadowed, circling the same green world in an endless dance. Those who later came to Tython would look up at these twin moons and see in them a reflection of the Force itself, the light and the dark bound together, each pulling against the other, each necessary to the whole. From these 2 moons, an entire philosophy would one day take root. Long before any order of Force users walked its hills, Tython had already known visitors. Ancient and powerful species had passed through this part of the galaxy in ages so distant that even their names had begun to fade. Among them were the Qua, a reptilian people of great wisdom and greater technology, who traveled the stars through gateways of their own making. They understood the Force in ways that few after them ever would, and they left their marks upon many worlds. There were also the Gree, another elder species, builders and tinkerers whose works outlived them by millennia. Tython bore the fingerprints of such travelers, quiet remnants half buried in its soil, waiting in silence for someone to find them. Whatever the Qua and the others had done on Tython, they had done long ago, and then they had gone. For a great span of time, the green world simply turned beneath its twin moons, its forests growing thick, its storms coming and going, its rich well of the Force deepening undisturbed. Creatures roamed its wilds, some gentle and some fierce, and the land settled into a long quiet. Yet the potential of the place remained, coiled and patient, like a seed buried in fertile ground that has not yet felt the warmth that will wake it. That warmth was coming. Far across the galaxy, in scattered corners on worlds that had never heard the name Tython, something was stirring. Great structures that had waited in silence for ages were beginning to hum with purpose once more, and beings who could feel the force in their blood were beginning to feel a pull they could not explain. A summons was about to sound across the stars, one that would gather the sensitive and the searching and carry them to the green world hidden in the deep core. The pilgrims were coming, and with them, the dawn of the Jedi would begin. In the year 36,453 BBY, 8 colossal pyramid ships rested on 8 scattered worlds across the galaxy. These structures, constructed millennia earlier by the Qua from layered high-density alloys, measured kilometers across their bases and reached high into the atmospheres of their host planets. Made of dark, seamless material, they sat dormant under thick layers of soil and vegetation. Vines scaled the slanted walls, and dirt filled the lower crevices. For generations, local inhabitants built settlements near the massive bases, treating the structures as natural mountains or inert monuments of stone. Deep inside the dark walls, internal mechanisms activated. A low, rhythmic vibration rumbled through the ground, shaking loose the accumulated dirt, moss, and vines from the massive sloping sides. Thick seams of bright blue light illuminated along the sharp edges of the pyramids, cutting through the overgrowth. A continuous hum emanated from the structures, vibrating the surrounding air and rippling the surface of nearby lakes and rivers. This sound carried a specific frequency. Individuals with a high concentration of midi-chlorians in their blood experienced a distinct physical pressure behind their eyes and a tightening sensation in their chests. The resonance pulled at their bodies, drawing them toward the origin of the sound. On the ice planet of Ando Prime, the Dai Bendu monks experienced this vibration first. Wearing thick, woven wool robes to block the driving snow, these monks trudged through deep drifts and climbed the frozen steps of the local pyramid. A massive stone ramp lowered from the side of the structure, grinding against the ice. The monks walked up the ramp and entered the glowing corridors inside. Identical events occurred on 7 other worlds in the same moment. On a dense forest planet, Wookiees climbed down from wooden dwellings in the high canopies, their thick fur brushing against wide leaves as they walked across mossy forest floors to reach the pyramid in their sector. On a desert world, Twi'leks wrapped in sun-bleached linen marched across dunes of shifting sand, leaving deep footprints as they followed the physical pull to the dark monolith. Selkath emerged from the crashing saltwater waves of their ocean world, their damp, mottled skin reflecting the blue light pouring from the open ramp. Cathar stepped out of temporary hunting camps, wading through tall, golden grass, and humans walked out of stone settlements and farming villages. All of them moved directly toward the ships, guided by the continuous hum vibrating in their bones. Inside the pyramids, the passengers found vast, geometric chambers lined with glowing panels. The air smelled of ozone, filtered dust, and warm metal. Large holding areas contained deep reservoirs of fresh water, harvested food provisions in sealed containers, and wide, smooth resting platforms elevated above the floor. The passengers sat on the cool metal, watching the internal lights pulse in sequence. The ships, bearing the ancient designation of Thoyor, operated automatically through an intricate network of Qua technology. Complex internal systems processed the weight of the passengers, registered the elevated midi-chlorian counts in their cells, and initiated the launch sequences. The dark metal ramps retracted, sealing the tight enclosures. The 8 Thoyor lifted off the ground simultaneously. The sheer mass of the ships displaced the air, creating massive updrafts that flattened the surrounding trees and scattered boulders across the landscape. The ships ascended vertically through the thick clouds, breaking out of the atmospheres of their respective planets and entering the vacuum of space. The blue seams along their outer hulls flared brilliantly as the hyperdrives engaged, stretching the starlight into long white streaks. The ships traveled directly into the deep core. The space surrounding their destination was filled with highly radioactive nebulas, clustered star systems, and dense gravity wells. Standard starships fractured and dissolved when exposed to these specific anomalies, their hulls tearing apart under the intense gravitational shear. The Thoyor maintained their structural integrity completely. Their thick outer layers deflected the radiation bursts, and their engines compensated for the erratic gravitational pulls, keeping the trajectory perfectly straight. Inside, the passengers experienced a smooth, level ride, isolated from the destructive forces tearing across the viewports. Days passed in transit. The beings inside the ships communicated through hand gestures, shared the provisions stored in the cargo bays, and meditated in the large, echoing chambers. The Thoyor maintained a constant temperature and cycled breathable air for the multitude of species on board. The glowing panels adjusted their brightness gradually, simulating day and night cycles to give the passengers a physical rhythm of waking and sleeping. The hyperdrive engines powered down, and the long white streaks of starlight condensed back into individual points. The 8 ships emerged from hyperspace in unison. Through the thick, crystalline viewports, the passengers looked out at their destination. A green and blue planet filled the view, framed by the backdrop of the deep core's churning red and purple nebulas. The ships descended together, breaking through Tython's upper atmosphere. The hulls heated to a bright orange from the intense friction, leaving long, thick trails of smoke in the sky. The 8 pyramids maintained a tight formation as they flew over Tython's oceans and vast continents. They tracked a specific signal projecting from the surface. Down below, rising from a wide, dense forest, stood a colossal stone monolith, a natural pillar reaching high above the tree line. Resting at the very peak of this monolith was a 9th Thoyor, significantly larger than the 8 currently descending from the sky. The arriving ships slowed their engines, hovering in a wide circle around the central pillar, preparing to land on the green world below. The 8 pyramid ships moved into a wide perimeter around the central stone pillar. A 9th Thoyor rested at the very top of the rock formation, its base significantly wider, and its peak reaching much higher than the newly arrived vessels. Thick, dark clouds gathered rapidly above the monolith, blocking the starlight. Electrical arcs snapped across the sky, connecting the heavy cloud banks in a bright web of energy. Flashes of white and purple lightning illuminated the 2 moons positioned directly overhead. Rain fell in heavy sheets, striking the dark metal hulls of the ships and running down the rocky surface of the central pillar. Static electricity raised the hair on the arms of the passengers inside, and the thick scent of ozone pushed through the ventilation systems. The 8 smaller ships held their positions in the air, their engines vibrating against the heavy wind currents sweeping across the valley. After a prolonged sequence of hovering, the 8 ships turned away from the central monolith. They broke their circular formation and separated, each taking a distinct trajectory across the planet's surface. One ship descended toward a jagged mountain range, its repulsor engines blowing away loose snow and shattered rock before settling onto a flat ridge. Another flew out over a deep, turbulent ocean, lowering its massive bulk until its flat bottom displaced the salt water, resting securely on a submerged reef. A third maneuvered down into a wide, dark chasm, scraping against the canyon walls as it lodged itself deep in the bedrock. The remaining ships touched down on flat grasslands, dense forest clearings, and dry, rocky plateaus. The heavy bases of the ships pressed into the soil, crushing the vegetation and coming to a complete, solid halt. The dark metal ramps lowered from the sides of the pyramids, grinding heavily against the planet's surface. The passengers walked down the steep inclines and stepped directly onto the ground. The air hung thick with humidity, smelling of wet topsoil, crushed fern leaves, and distant salt water. The gravity pulled firmly at their muscles, requiring the travelers to adjust their footing as they waded through the tall grass and thick mud. They gripped wooden staffs, iron-forged tools, and sealed provision containers brought from their homeworlds, scanning the dense foliage surrounding the landing sites. High above the tree lines, winged creatures with sharp, hooked beaks circled the cleared landing zones. These Tythonian raptors dove abruptly toward the ground, snapping their jagged jaws at small mammals scurrying through the brush, before pulling up sharply into the clouds. Heavy, scaled silic lizards crawled over the exposed tree roots, their long, curved claws digging deep into the mud. The lizards flicked their thick, forked tongues, watching the humanoids emerge from the ships. The passengers grouped tightly together, raising their staffs and metal implements, keeping their eyes locked on the shifting shadows within the dense forests. The Twi'leks, Wookiees, humans, Cathar, and Selkath began gathering thick branches, dead wood, and loose river stones. They stacked the dry wood in the center of the clearings and sparked fires using flint and steel, watching the bright orange flames illuminate the dark tree trunks. Cathar hunters tracked the heavy silic lizards through the low brush, throwing spears and returning with thick slabs of meat to cook over the open flames. Humans and Wookiees lifted heavy timber together, binding the logs with stripped green vines to construct rudimentary shelters against the driving rain. They communicated through immediate hand gestures, pointed at required materials, shared their tools, and sat shoulder to shoulder around the heat of the fire pits. The Dai Bendu monks stood among the different species, observing the cooperative labor. One of the monks pointed to the diverse group of builders, then pointed down to the soil beneath their feet and spoke the word Jedi. In the spoken language of the Dai Bendu, the word translated to a mystic center. The monk traced a perfect circle in the dirt with the end of a wooden staff, then tapped the exact center of the shape with a finger. The Twi'leks, humans, and Cathar repeated the word aloud, mimicking the monk's exact pronunciation and cadence. They used sharp rocks to carve the circular symbol into the bark of the surrounding trees and pressed the shape into the wet clay near the riverbanks. The localized groups around all 8 landing sites repeated this specific word, using it to identify the collective gathering of species currently living around the bases of the dark metal ships. The newly named Jedi sat around the fire pits, observing the thick canopy of trees and the dark sky above. They focused their attention inward, sensing the steady hum of the planet beneath them. Tython generated a massive, continuous current of force energy, unlike anything the travelers had experienced on their homeworlds. The energy flowed through the soil, moved up the trunks of the massive trees, and circulated through the atmosphere. The Jedi realized that Thoyor had not brought them to this specific planet by accident. They were gathered here to study this energy, to measure it, and to comprehend their exact physical relationship to it. When the cloud cover broke during the night, The Jedi looked up and observed the twin moons orbiting the planet. They noted the visual contrast between the two orbital bodies. One moon reflected bright, clean light down onto the forest floor, casting sharp shadows behind the trees. The other moon absorbed the starlight, presenting a heavy, dark sphere against the black vacuum of space. The Jedi observed the orbit of these moons over several weeks. They tracked how the gravitational pull of the two bodies affected the ocean tides and the atmospheric pressure systems of Tython. They recognized that the planet maintained its orbital stability only because the opposing forces of the two moons kept it perfectly centered. The Jedi applied this observation directly to their study of the Force. They identified the bright moon as Ashla, representing the light, calm, and passive aspects of the energy they felt. They identified the dark moon as Bogan, representing the shadow, aggression, and active power within that same energy field. They documented the physical effects of drawing too heavily on one aspect over the other. When a group of Jedi focused exclusively on the Ashla, sitting in passive meditation for days and refusing to hunt or build, their bodies grew weak, and a sudden, violent rainstorm flooded their camp. When another group tapped deeply into the Bogan, using aggressive force energy to rip trees from the ground and hurl boulders into the rivers, the ground beneath them fractured, releasing scalding steam from deep tectonic vents. Through trial and error, injuries, and careful documentation, the early Tythons established a definitive law of survival on the green world. The Force required absolute harmony. Tython reacted violently to any extreme imbalance, generating immediate physical consequences in the form of groundquakes, localized typhoons, and electrical storms. The Jedi codified this understanding into a strict guiding philosophy. They swore a vow to study the Force in all its forms, analyzing the Ashla and the Bogan equally. They trained themselves to walk precisely in the center of the two extremes, refusing to favor the light over the dark, or the dark over the light. They gathered wide, flat stones from the riverbeds and used metal chisels to carve the tenets of their new code into the rock faces. They wrote down their observations, detailing how the careful application of Ashla could heal physical wounds, while the controlled use of Bogan could move heavy objects and provide strength in battle. They practiced shifting between the two states, monitoring their own internal heart rates and breathing patterns to ensure they never lingered in one state long enough to trigger a reaction from the planet. The Jedi did not view the dark side as an inherent evil, nor did they view the light side as an absolute good. They viewed them as two ends of a weighted scale, and their entire existence was dedicated to keeping the needle perfectly dead center. The Jedi leaders, chosen from the most disciplined among the different species, stood before the carved stones and recited the vow to the gathered camps. They committed to a life of rigorous physical and mental conditioning. They trained with wooden staffs and iron blades, striking heavy wooden posts to build muscle, then sitting perfectly still in the freezing rain to build focus. They tested their limits, deliberately drawing on the aggressive power of Bogan to fuel their strikes, then immediately purging that aggression by drawing on the calm energy of Ashla to lower their heart rates. If an individual failed to find the center and the sky began to darken with localized storm clouds, the other Jedi physically restrained them, forcing them into a meditative state until the atmospheric pressure stabilized. Through these strict methods, the pilgrims forged themselves into a unified order, permanently bound to the demanding environment of Tython. Over the span of 1,000 years, the descendants of the original Tythons transformed the temporary camps around the landing sites into permanent settlements. They cut heavy blocks of grey granite from the mountain quarries and transported them using repulsor sleds and their physical mastery of the Force. They mixed river clay with crushed stone to form thick, durable mortar, sealing the walls of 9 distinct temple cities. Masons carved intricate geometric patterns into the heavy stone doors, and metalworkers smelted bronze and iron to forge structural reinforcements for the high vaulted ceilings. These cities expanded outward from the base of each thoyor, serving as dedicated centers of learning and focused physical study. The constant hum of the pyramid ships reverberated through the stone floors of the new structures, keeping the inhabitants continuously anchored to the energy of the planet. At the very center of the continent, atop the high stone monolith, they constructed Akar-Kesh. This structure served as the Temple of Balance, built directly beneath the largest of the pyramid ships. Heavy rain accumulated at the peak and drained through carved channels in the polished stone floor, feeding 8 distinct rivers that flowed down the steep sides of the monolith and spread across the surrounding valleys. Far to the west, resting on buoyant wooden pontoons tethered to an underwater reef, the Jedi built Maharakesh, the Temple of Healing. The smell of sea salt, iodine, and crushed kelp filled the open-air medical wards. Here, practitioners applied organic salves to open wounds and focused their energy on mending torn muscle fibers and setting fractured bones, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the floating docks. High in the northern peaks, the builders constructed Stav-Kesh directly into the snow-covered bedrock. As the Temple of War, its wide stone courtyards echoed with the continuous ringing of heavy hammers striking hot iron. The Jedi forged their weapons and practiced physical combat in the thin, freezing air. Their thick leather boots crunched on the morning frost as they sparred with wooden staffs and sharp metal blades. The remaining temples took shape across equally demanding terrains. The architects built Anil-Kesh, the Temple of Science, as a massive stone bridge spanning a deep, jagged chasm. They used complex structural engineering and heavy iron suspension cables to support the laboratories directly over the open air, where researchers observed the erratic weather patterns and geological shifts of the planet. Deep beneath the planet's surface, illuminated by patches of glowing blue moss and large crystal deposits, the enclosed subterranean environment of Qigong-Kesh allowed the Jedi to study internal force mechanics. The still, silent air aided their focus on their own respiration and cellular functions. The Jedi built Kaleth among the massive trees of the forest, framing the Temple of Knowledge with tall, arched doorways. Inside, scholars stacked bound paper scrolls, carved stone tablets, and early data storage devices on high wooden shelves, continuously logging the history and biological data of the green world. At the Temple of Bodhi, residents ground colored minerals into wet pigments and carved large blocks of imported marble, focusing their force sensitivity through rigorous physical art. Finally, they constructed Padawan-Kesh in a wide, flat valley. This complex contained long rows of sleeping barracks, open dirt rings for physical conditioning, and large communal dining halls, functioning entirely as the academy for the youngest members of the Order. To govern these 9 scattered cities, the Jedi formed a strict leadership hierarchy. Each temple operated under the direction of a single temple master. These 9 masters traveled to Akar-Kesh at regular intervals, sitting in a circular stone chamber around a central hearth to share information and dictate the collective laws of the Jedi. They wore heavy woven robes, dyed in specific colors, to represent their respective temples. Among the first to hold one of these titles was a woman named Nordia Graal. She possessed severe, sharp facial features, and she wore thick leather braces wrapped tightly around her forearms. Nordia Graal took command of Padawan Kesh during its early foundational years. She walked the packed dirt paths of the academy every morning, observing the young students as they practiced their physical stances and lifting techniques in the open air. She documented their progress on thin sheets of parchment, noting the limits of their physical and mental adaptation. They learned the basic fundamentals of the force within the academy walls. To survive the violent storms, steep mountains, and predators of the Tythonian wilderness, they required practical exposure to the outside environment. Nordia Graal drafted a strict physical curriculum for the young Jedi, sending them out from the enclosed safety of Padawan Kesh. She mapped specific land routes connecting all 9 temples across the diverse ecosystems of the planet. To achieve the rank of a full Jedi Ranger, the students gathered heavy canvas packs, filled their canteens with filtered water, and tied sturdy leather boots to their feet. They reviewed the topography charts drawn by the masters, checked the bindings on their walking staffs, and stepped out of the heavy wooden gates of the academy. They began a long, solitary trek across the harsh terrain, marching on foot to reach the distant stone temples. The Jedi established a specific progression for their members, organizing their ranks according to physical capability and demonstrated knowledge. Young students began as Padawans, living strictly within the walls of Padawan Kesh to learn basic survival skills and fundamental force techniques. Once a Padawan demonstrated sufficient control over their physical reflexes and emotional responses, the Temple Master stripped them of their academy uniform and handed them a heavy canvas pack. They gained the title of Journeyer, and the order required them to leave the academy on foot. This required migration, known as the Great Journey, tested the physical endurance of the young Jedi. The journeyers navigated the dense Tythonian forests, mapping their own routes by observing the stars and the positions of Ashla and Bogan. They carried iron blades to defend themselves against the sharp-beaked raptors and scaled silic lizards that hunted in the heavy brush. They climbed sheer rock faces to reach Stav Kesh, their hands bleeding from the sharp granite edges, and swam through freezing saltwater currents to board the floating pontoons of Marrakesh. At each temple, the journeyers presented themselves to the Temple Master and engaged in specific, specialized training. They forged hot metal into weapons at Stav Kesh, memorized planetary star charts at Caleth, and learned to apply organic healing salves at Marrakesh. The masters evaluated their progress, ensuring the students developed a balanced skill set across all disciplines rather than focusing on a single physical capability. Once a journeyer successfully trained at all 9 temples and survived the harsh environmental conditions between them, they achieved the rank of Ranger. The Rangers traveled beyond the temple cities, patrolling the deep forests and wide plains of Tython to map new geological formations and monitor the local wildlife. Those who demonstrated exceptional mastery of the Force and deep understanding of the Jedi Code eventually earned the title of Temple Master, taking on the responsibility of guiding the next generation of students. The Order strictly monitored the balance of its members during this progression. The Temple Masters observed the physical behavior and emotional state of every journeyer and ranger. If an individual spent too much time practicing the passive techniques of Ashla, their physical muscles began to atrophy, and the air around them grew still and cold. If an individual gave in to the aggressive impulses of Bogan, their heart rate spiked, and static electricity snapped from their fingertips. The Temple Masters intervened physically when these imbalances occurred, removing the weapons and packs from the affected individual. The Jediya enforced a strict exile system to correct these imbalances. They calculated the exact orbital trajectories of Tithon's two moons and constructed small, functional transport ships capable of breaking the planet's atmosphere. If a Jedi leaned too far into the dark, aggressive energy of the Force, the Masters loaded them onto a transport and launched them directly toward the bright moon, Ashla. The exiled Jedi lived alone on the pale, rocky surface of the moon, forced to meditate in the blinding light until their aggressive impulses subsided. Conversely, if a Jedi lost themselves in the passive, detached energy of the light, the Masters launched them to the dark moon, Bogan. The exiles survived in the deep shadows and freezing temperatures of the dark moon, forced to find physical resilience and internal heat to stay alive. The exiles remained on the moons for months or even years until the Temple Masters sensed a return to the center and sent a transport to retrieve them. This rigorous system of physical trials and strictly enforced balance sustained the Jedi Order. They lived completely isolated from the rest of the galaxy, relying entirely on the resources found within the Tython system. They hunted in the forests, harvested the riverbeds, and forged their own tools. For thousands of years, the Jedi maintained this closed, self-sufficient society, deeply embedded in the physical demands of the green world and the constant, vibrating hum of the 9 Thoyor ships. Decades turned into centuries, and the populations living within the 9 temple cities expanded. Mothers and fathers produced new generations of offspring within the heavy stone walls. As these children grew, the temple masters observed distinct biological variances among the youth. Certain children possessed completely quiet cells. They experienced the Tythonian environment strictly through their 5 physical senses, registering the howling wind only as moving air and the wet soil only as damp earth. The vibrating hum of the 9 Thoyor ships passed right through their bodies, leaving their internal cells completely still. They required physical heat to stay warm and thick animal hides to block the rain, possessing strictly physical means to interact with the environment. These individuals relied exclusively on manual tools and physical labor to manipulate their surroundings. The environment of Tython required constant internal regulation for survival. Whenever the tectonic plates shifted and the heavy ground cracked open, the sensitive Tythons lowered their heart rates, planted their feet firmly, and anchored their bodies using the localized energy currents. The individuals holding quiet cells absorbed the extreme physical impact of the shifting crust. They lost their footing on the vibrating stone pathways, falling onto the sharp gravel and sustaining deep lacerations. During sudden atmospheric pressure drops, rapid wind currents tore the heavy wooden roofs off the dwellings. The intense storms exposed the inhabitants directly to the driving hail, freezing rain, and thick, sliding mud. The quiet-celled Tythons suffered broken limbs, shivering violently as their skin turned pale from the freezing temperatures during these sudden terrestrial shifts. The inhabitants constructed the settlement of Aurum in a wide, grassy valley, filling the space with low stone houses, paved courtyards, and deep freshwater wells. During the middle of a standard planetary rotation, a massive atmospheric disturbance materialized directly over the settlement. Thick purple lightning struck the tall stone columns, heating the moisture inside the heavy granite blocks and exploding them into jagged shrapnel. High-velocity winds uprooted the massive ancient trees surrounding the valley, driving the heavy trunks straight through the stone walls of the homes. The individuals holding quiet cells suffered shattered ribs and fractured skulls, pinned under the collapsing roofs and the falling timber. The survivors dug through the wet rubble with their bare hands, lifting the heavy stones to pull the bruised, bleeding bodies of their neighbors from the wreckage. The survivors laid the corpses in long rows on the muddy ground. The temple masters walked among the bodies and immediately organized a system-wide evacuation of the vulnerable population. They directed the individuals holding quiet cells to pack their physical belongings. These individuals filled heavy canvas sacks with woven clothing, forged iron tools, carved wooden utensils, and dried provisions. The sensitive Tythons constructed large sublight transport vessels in the open fields. They riveted thick metal plates to reinforce chassis frames, welded heavy bulkheads, and installed massive atmospheric thrusters. The evacuees boarded the metal transports, walking up the steep steel ramps with their heavy sacks slung over their shoulders. The thrusters ignited, burning circular patches into the grass beneath them. The vessels ascended straight up through the thick cloud cover, departing the green world in a mass exodus designated as the Second Migration. The transports traveled through the dark, cold vacuum of the immediate star system, charting courses toward the surrounding orbital bodies. The passengers disembarked onto completely new, diverse terrains. On the world of Shikakwa, they stepped out into dense, humid jungles and walked along the shores of wide, deep oceans. The settlers hacked through the thick foliage with their iron blades, clearing space to construct sprawling cities out of harvested timber and cut stone. On Skagora, they encountered massive, continent-spanning forests, with tree trunks measuring dozens of meters in diameter. They built elevated wooden walkways and heavy timber platforms suspended high above the dark, root-tangled forest floor. The transports touched down on the red, dusty plains of Kalimar, where the colonizers set up vast agricultural grids, digging deep irrigation trenches to cultivate the dry soil. Other transports landed on the jagged volcanic surface of Fury's Gate. The inhabitants built reinforced mining colonies directly over the glowing cracks in the crust, using heavy machinery to extract raw metals and volatile gases from the deep geological vents. They established enclosed, pressurized domes on the moons of Aubry and Maur, navigating the low gravity by wearing heavy, weighted boots. The populations of these newly colonized locations expanded rapidly, digging deep mines, paving wide trade roads, and pouring concrete foundations for massive industrial centers. These locations collectively became the settled worlds. Back on Tython, the temple masters closed the heavy iron gates of their temple cities. The Jedi sat in the silent stone courtyards, breathing the cold air and watching the distant starships move as tiny specks of light across the night sky. They focused entirely on their physical conditioning and deep meditation practices, breathing the quiet air of their isolated world as the colonies multiplied across the distant stars. Over the next 10,000 years, the Tython system operated under a stable, distinct separation. The Jedi maintained their isolation on Tython, focusing entirely on the physical conditioning required by the planet and the deep study of the Force. They replaced worn cobblestones in their temple courtyards, rethatched the wooden roofs of their barracks, and continually documented the shifts in the atmospheric pressure. Their numbers remained constant, strictly controlled by the demanding physical environment. Meanwhile, the populations on the settled worlds expanded exponentially. Heavy sublight freighters transported harvested lumber from Skagora to the growing shipyards over Kalimar. Industrial mining platforms on Fury's Gate extracted thick veins of raw ore, feeding the foundries that supplied metal for the massive, sprawling cities covering Shikakwa. The settled worlds established clear trade routes, organized complex governing bodies, and developed heavy energy weapons to protect their shipments from local pirates. The Jedi Rangers monitored the system from the borders of Tython. They flew small, maneuverable patrol craft with reinforced hulls, scanning the sensor arrays for distinct spatial anomalies or unauthorized vessel entries into the restricted space around the Green World. Occasionally, the settled worlds requested Jedi intervention to settle violent territorial disputes or to stop organized pirate raids. The Rangers landed their ships on the dusty plains of Kalimar or the thick mud of Shikakwa, stepping out with their forged iron blades and heavy woven cloaks. They employed their physical mastery of the Force, deflecting heavy slug-thrower rounds by manipulating the kinetic energy in the air and disarming combatants through highly coordinated physical strikes. They returned to Tython immediately following the resolution of these conflicts, refusing to hold political office or accept material compensation from the colonial governments. This strict separation generated a slow, steady friction. The populations of the settled worlds walked through dense, multi-level cities, exchanging heavily minted currency for goods and relying completely on their own manufactured technology. They observed the Jedi arriving from Tython, resolving complex problems with silent, physical efficiency, and then departing without explanation. Some of the ruling families on Shikakwa, dressed in fine, imported silks and surrounded by armed guards, began to view the isolated order with distinct suspicion. They noted that the Jedi possessed physical abilities that the regular colonial populations could not replicate, and they recognized that Tython occupied the exact central point of the entire star system, acting as a physical choke point for all deep space navigation. Despite this growing friction, the system functioned continuously. The massive transport freighters burned long trails of engine exhaust across the night sky, while the Jedi sat in the silent stone courtyards of Akarkesh, tracking the orbit of the twin moons. The Temple Masters documented the 10,000 years of continuous operation. They recorded the construction of new orbital stations over Mao and noted the slight variations in the magnetic fields generated by the expanding cities on Shikakwa. The Jedi continued their internal progressions, sending new journeyers out into the dense Tythonian forests to map the trails to Stavkesh and Maharakesh. During this long period, the physical appearance of the Jedi shifted. The strict environmental isolation forced the different species to intermingle over thousands of generations. The distinct physical traits of the original pilgrims, the sharp cheekbones of the Cathar, the varying skin pigments of the Twi'leks and humans, began to blend. The Tythons developed uniform physical characteristics, specifically adapted to the high gravity and thick atmosphere of the Green World. They possessed dense muscle structures, slightly thicker skin to block the localized radiation spikes, and highly responsive cardiovascular systems. They wore the same heavy woven fabrics, wielded the same forged iron blades, and stood perfectly still in the driving rain. They existed as a single, hardened people, completely disconnected from the rapid industrial expansion happening on the settled worlds. Inside the quiet halls of Kaleth, the Temple of Knowledge, the scholars stacked thousands of physical scrolls and solid data drives detailing this 10,000-year span. They categorized the agricultural yields of the colonies, the atmospheric compositions of the moons, and the specific kinetic equations used by the Rangers during their patrols. The records showed a perfect, unbroken timeline of physical stability. However, the Temple Masters, sitting around the central hearth at Akarkesh, observed the growing accumulation of heavy weapons and military transports manufactured by the ruling families on Shikakwa. They noted the increasing frequency of pirate raids along the deep space trade routes, and they recognized the physical pressure building along the borders of their isolated world. In the year 25805 BBY, a Twi'lek named Hadia took command of the ruling families on Shikakwa. She wore thick, overlapping plates of molded steel over her shoulders, heavy greaves on her shins, and carried a high-powered energy rifle slung across her back. Hadia ordered the local foundries to double their output, welding heavy artillery cannons onto the hulls of commercial sublight freighters. She stood before assembled crowds in the deep jungle cities, speaking loudly over the humming engines of her massing fleet. She directed the populations of the settled worlds to consolidate their raw materials, distributing surplus rations and forged weaponry to the dissatisfied factions on Kalimar and Fury's Gate. The citizens of these worlds boarded the retrofitted freighters in massive numbers, packing the cargo holds with crates of ammunition, explosive charges, and medical supplies. They aligned their thrusters, venting massive plumes of white-hot exhaust, and launched into the vacuum of space, initiating a system-wide military offensive known as the Despot War. Hadia directed her armada toward the orbital stations and agricultural centers of the neighboring planets. Her ships fired concentrated beams of thermal energy, melting the heavy durasteel bulkheads of the outer mining colonies and igniting the dry, yellow grass of the Kalimar plains. The armies landed their heavy dropships on the soil, marching through the streets with repeating slug throwers and burning the wooden walkways of Skargora to the ground. They pushed through the deep space navigational choke points and descended directly into the atmosphere of Tython. The Jedi closed the heavy granite doors of their temple cities and drew their forged iron blades. The combat occurred in the thick mud and heavy rain of the Green World. Jedi Rangers intercepted Hadia's ground troops in the dense forests, swinging their metal weapons to sever the barrels of the energy rifles, and using physical kinetic pushes to throw the armored soldiers into the thick tree trunks. The air smelled of burning ozone, wet earth, and charred flesh. The fighting culminated outside the high stone walls of Calith. The heavy boots of the combatants churned the soil into deep, wet trenches, and artillery shells shattered the ancient trees surrounding the temple. During a close-quarters engagement in the mud, Hadia sustained massive physical trauma. Her armored body fell onto the wet grass, bleeding from deep lacerations. Static filled the communication channels, and the invading officers immediately broke their formations. The soldiers dropped their weapons onto the ground, scrambled into their surviving freighters, and retreated back into the upper atmosphere. The surviving Jedi walked across the torn landscape, dragging the corpses of their fallen members back to the temple courtyards. They dug deep graves in the Tythonian soil with iron shovels and dismantled the ruined freighters left behind by the invading forces. Stonemasons used heavy chisels to replace the shattered granite columns at the temples, and laborers planted new saplings across the burned acreage around the perimeters. Two specific Jedi Rangers, Dogan Locke and Hawk Rio, participated directly in the heaviest physical combat of this conflict. Dogan Locke, a human male with sharp features and tight facial muscles, carried a long iron blade severely chipped along the edge from repeated strikes against dense armor plating. Hawk Rio, a Twi'lek with deep green skin and heavily scarred leku, walked with a pronounced limp resulting from a localized explosive shockwave sustained near the outer walls of Caleth. They sat together in the damp medical wards of Maharakesh, watching the healers apply organic salves to the open wounds of the surviving Tythons. They observed the high number of bodies wrapped in white burial shrouds and the physical devastation wrought by the off-world technology. Surviving the frontline engagements required the continuous channeling of adrenaline and the heavy application of aggressive kinetic force against their enemies. The Jedi Order altered its daily routines following the burial of the dead. The Temple Masters ordered the production of heavier armor and mandated extended physical combat drills in the courtyards of Stav Kesh. The quiet focus of the previous millennia transitioned into loud, continuous sparring and the constant friction of whetstones sharpening iron blades. The air within the temple cities smelled heavily of sweat, burning coal, and hot metal. Dagon Lok stood in the center of these changes, his jaw clenched and his breathing shallow. He spent long hours staring at the dark sphere of Bogan in the night sky, keeping his heart rate elevated and retaining the residual adrenaline in his bloodstream long after the fighting ceased. He consumed his daily rations alone in the cold stone corridors of the temples, as distinct, vivid images began to flash rapidly across his field of vision. Dagon Lok documented the specific details of his visual disturbances on thin flimsiplast sheets in the archives of Kaleth. He described massive fleets of starships possessing distinct, curved metallic hulls, unlike the boxy sublight freighters used by the settled worlds. He detailed tall, gaunt humanoids with high, sloping craniums and thick, amphibian skin operating the vessels. In these recurring visions, these unknown beings wielded weapons that emitted focused beams of raw, dark-side energy, and they used heavy iron collars to chain force-sensitive individuals to the control panels of their ships. Locke recorded the physical sensation of burning ozone and the loud, high-pitched hum of their specific technology. He categorized these beings under the phonetic designation Rakata, a term that repeatedly echoed in his ears during the visual episodes. Locke presented his detailed records to the Temple Masters at Akar Kesh. He laid out the flimsiplast sheets on the stone floor, describing the high probability of an external, system-wide invasion. He argued that the recent Despot War exposed the physical vulnerability of the Tython system and insisted that the Jedi immediately transition their focus from passive meditation to aggressive military preparation. The Temple Masters observed Locke's physical condition during his presentation. They noted his dilated pupils, his rapid speech patterns, and the distinct crackle of static electricity generated by his constant pacing. The Masters determined that the trauma of the Despot War had severely damaged his internal equilibrium. They concluded that Locke was hallucinating, overwhelmed by the residual Bogan energy he refused to purge from his system. The Council officially stripped Dagon Locke of his rank. They confiscated his chipped iron blade and escorted him down the steep stone steps of Akar Kesh. The Masters loaded Locke into a heavily reinforced atmospheric transport and launched the vessel directly toward the dark moon. Locke stepped off the transport onto the freezing, jagged surface of Bogan, watching the ship break orbit and return to the green world below. He pulled his heavy-woven cloak tightly around his shoulders, shivering as the ambient temperature dropped rapidly. He found an overhang of sharp rock and sat down on the cold dust, rubbing his hands together to generate physical heat. For 7 standard years, Dagon Locke remained on the dark moon. He survived by hunting the small, blind predators that burrowed in the deep craters, using focused kinetic strikes to snap their spines before cooking their meat over small, concentrated thermal vents. He mapped the entire surface of Bogan on foot, his leather boots wearing thin against the sharp volcanic rock. He did not engage in the passive meditation required to return to the center. Instead, Locke deliberately fueled his anger against the Temple Masters. He used the continuous cold and the physical isolation to sharpen his focus, drawing heavily on the dark energy of the moon to sustain his internal body temperature. Locke spent hours standing on the highest ridges, staring out at the vacuum of space. He visualized the curved metallic ships from his initial visions, tracking hypothetical trajectories across the visible star clusters. He used sharp stones to carve the specific anatomical features of the Rakata into the walls of the deep craters, committing the details to his physical memory. He practiced swinging heavy iron bars salvaged from old transport debris, refining his combat forms and increasing the speed of his physical strikes. Locke completely abandoned the Jedi philosophy of balance, accepting the dark energy of Bogan as a necessary, functional tool for his own physical survival and his preparation for the war he knew was coming. His continuous isolation on the dark moon cemented his absolute certainty in his own visions, leaving him waiting in the freezing dark for the specific event that would prove him right. Far outside the borders of the Tython system, Dagon Locke's visions represented actual, ongoing physical events. The beings he identified as the Rakata operated a massive, expanding network of colonized worlds known as the Infinite Empire. The Rakata stood over 2 meters tall, possessing wide, flat faces, eyes positioned on thick stalks extending from their skulls, and hands ending in sharp, heavy claws. They communicated using a guttural, highly consonant-heavy language. Millennia earlier, the ancient Kwa species had provided the Rakata with basic instruction in physical sciences and early warp gate mechanics, sharing their technological blueprints. The Rakata took these blueprints, reinforced the structural integrity of the designs using dense heavy metals, and weaponized the underlying energy systems. They completely inverted the Kwa's teachings, focusing entirely on drawing power from the aggressive, violent extremes of the dark side of the Force. The Rakatan engineers designed a fleet of colossal warships. These vessels featured long, curved outer hulls forged from black durasteel, completely devoid of external viewports or external thruster vents. The interior corridors smelled of sulfur and stagnant air, illuminated by harsh, red tactical lighting. Deep within the central engineering decks, the Rakata installed massive spherical containment chambers. They filled these chambers with thousands of Force-sensitive individuals captured from conquered worlds. The engineers strapped these individuals into heavy iron harnesses, driving thick metal neural pins directly into their spinal columns. The specialized machinery extracted the biological energy produced by the physical pain and extreme fear of these prisoners, channeling that raw dark side energy directly into the ship's hyperdrive motivators and weapons systems. The Rakata did not use conventional fuel. Their empire expanded by burning the biological energy of the beings they enslaved. To maintain the required fuel source for their fleet, the Rakatan military deployed specialized hunters to scour the galaxy for planets with high concentrations of midi-chlorians. The Rakatada designated these specific individuals as Force Hounds. The Force Hounds were usually humanoid, selected from conquered populations based on their inherent physical sensitivity to energy fields. The Rakata stripped the hounds of their original names, tattooed thick black barcodes onto their foreheads and cheeks using heated needles, and forced them to wear heavy iron collars at all times. The training process required the hounds to suppress all physical manifestations of empathy or compassion. The overseers forced the hounds to execute weak or injured slaves using crude kinetic strikes, punishing any hesitation with severe electrical shocks delivered through the iron collars. The Force Hounds stood on the command decks of the Rakatan warships, their tattooed faces bathed in the red light of the tactical displays. They closed their eyes and projected their senses outward, scanning the surrounding vacuum of space for the specific physical hum of the Force. When a hound detected a strong energy signature, they relayed the exact spatial coordinates to the Rakatan commanders. The black warships immediately adjusted their trajectories, dropping out of hyperspace above entirely new, unsuspecting planets. The Rakatan ground forces descended in heavily armored dropships, firing concentrated thermal beams into the local settlements and capturing every Force-sensitive individual they could physically restrain. The continuous cycle of locating strong energy fields, capturing the inhabitants, and plugging them into the containment chambers fueled the rapid, violent expansion of the Infinite Empire across the galaxy, bringing them closer to the isolated green world in the deep core. A human male, designated as Zesh, planted his heavy boots on the observation deck of the Rakatan warship, designated the Devourer. Thick black lines of ink formed barcodes across his forehead, cheeks, and chin, permanently embedded under his skin by heated needles. A heavy iron collar locked tightly around his throat, connecting directly to his nervous system. During his early physical conditioning, Rakatan overseers forced Zesh into enclosed fighting pits with other captive youths. Whenever Zesh delayed his strikes or lowered his fists, the overseers activated the collar, driving severe electrical currents into his spine. The shocks caused his muscles to lock and forced him to his knees, burning the flesh around his neck. Zesh adapted to this conditioning by executing rapid, lethal kinetic strikes against his opponents. He stepped over the bleeding bodies on the stone floor with a steady heart rate, his facial muscles completely relaxed, keeping the collar dormant. He carried a cylindrical metal hilt clipped to his belt. Pressing the activation stud projected a glowing violet blade of contained dark side energy. He used this foresaber to slice through thick bone and dense muscle, leaving cauterized wounds that smelled of burnt carbon. He operated entirely as a focused weapon for the Infinite Empire. Zesh served directly under Predor Tulkar, the Rakatan commander of the Devourer. Tulkar possessed thick, mottled green skin and wore heavy black armor plates over his wide shoulders. In the red light of the warship's bridge, Tulkar ordered Zesh to locate new fuel sources. Zesh closed his eyes and expanded his physical senses into the vacuum of space, searching for the specific high-frequency hum of midi-chlorian clusters. He detected a strong energy signature and fed the exact spatial coordinates into the ship's navigation computer. The Devourer dropped out of hyperspace above a binary star system, hovering over a desert planet known locally as Tatooine. Rakatan dropships deployed to the sandy surface, firing concentrated thermal blasts that melted the dunes into sheets of black glass. The soldiers dragged the surviving, Force-sensitive inhabitants onto the ships by their limbs, loading them directly into the spherical containment chambers to fuel the hyperdrive engines. Zesh watched the extraction from the bridge via the internal tactical screens, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for his next objective. Another Rakatan commander, Predor Skalnas, boarded the Devourer and entered the primary command deck. Skalnas stood taller than Tulkar, wearing draped crimson robes, his heavy claws clicking rhythmically against the metal floor grates. A female forcehound named Trill followed closely behind Skalnas. Trill bore identical black barcode tattoos on her face and wore the same heavy iron collar as Zesh. Sweat formed on Trill's forehead, slight tremors shook her hands, and dried blood crusted around her nostrils. Skalnas approached Tulkar and demanded the immediate use of Zesh. Skalnas required the coordinates of a specific, massive energy field located deep within the center of the galaxy. Trill had attempted to isolate this location for weeks. The heavy radiation storms and dense gravity wells of the deep core disrupted her physical focus, causing severe cerebral hemorrhaging and acute physical collapse. Skalnas required a hound with a higher midi-chlorian count to penetrate the dense interference. Tulkar agreed to the demand, and Zesh stepped forward to the central navigation console. He planted his boots on the metal grating, lowered his chin, and slowed his breathing. He projected his senses into the chaotic space of the deep core, pushing past the burning red nebulas and the violent gravitational shears. The physical strain caused fresh blood to drip from Zesh's nose, running down over his lips and splashing onto his heavy chest armor. He pushed his awareness deeper into the volatile sector until he felt a massive, vibrating pulse of energy. It was a dense, concentrated hum of raw force, rattling the teeth in his skull and surpassing the signature of Tatooine and all previously targeted worlds. Sesh raised his right hand and pressed his clawed gauntlet against the glowing star map, locking in the exact coordinates of the green planet Tython. As Zesh maintained his connection to those distant coordinates, a distinct physical sensation manifested in his chest. The constant, burning heat of the Bogan energy that fueled his abilities encountered a cool, steady resistance. For a fraction of a second, the deep tension in Zesh's jaw released. His heart rate dropped to a slow, steady rhythm, and the metallic taste of adrenaline faded from his tongue. The planet projecting the signal possessed an energy field in complete, stable harmony. Zesh opened his eyes and wiped the blood from his upper lip with the back of his gauntlet. Tulkar and Skalnas observed the locked coordinates on the display screen. They barked guttural commands to the bridge crew. The heavy thrusters of the Devourer ignited, vibrating the floor plates beneath Zesh's boots. The massive black warship adjusted its trajectory, aiming its armored hull straight into the dense star clusters of the deep core, carrying its crew and its living fuel directly toward the center of the isolated Tython system. Dagon Locke sat cross-legged on the jagged basalt of Bogan. The ambient temperature registered well below freezing, and a thick layer of white frost clung to the heavy wool of his cloak. A sudden, violent spike in the surrounding energy field forced his eyes open. A highly concentrated projection manifested directly in his visual cortex. He saw the black durasteel hull of a massive warship tearing through a dense red nebula. He saw the face of a human male, marked with thick black barcode tattoos across his cheeks and forehead. He heard the sharp, high-pitched hiss of a violet energy blade igniting. Locke dug his fingernails deeply into his palms, breaking the skin and drawing warm blood. The specific physical details of the projection matched the carvings he had scraped into the crater walls. He stood up, shaking the frost from his shoulders, and tracked the invisible trajectory of the approaching mass in the dark sky above him. Down on the surface of Tython, Shay Coda gripped the thick leather reins of a winged Tythonian ranker. She pulled the heavy beast through a steep, vertical dive above the dense forest canopy. High-velocity wind whipped through her dark hair and caused her eyes to water. Shay bore a thick, raised scar across her left shoulder blade, a physical remnant of flying shrapnel from the Despot War that had killed her parents. The identical visual projection struck her optic nerves mid-flight, carrying the physical impact of a concussive shockwave. The winged ranker shrieked, banking sharply to the side as Shay lost her grip on the reins. She absorbed the images of the tattooed face, the violet blade, and the crashing black warship. She pulled the leather straps hard, forcing the beast to land heavily on a wide, rocky outcropping. Her heart hammered rapidly against her ribs, and she tasted copper on her tongue. The sheer density of the projected energy pointed directly toward the deep tectonic chasm known as the Rift. In the packed dirt courtyard of Stav Kesh, Seknos Wrath swung a heavy iron broadsword in wide, continuous arcs. Crimson skin covered his heavily muscled frame, and distinct, sharp bone spurs protruded along his jawline and brow ridges. Sweat dripped from his chin, forming dark, wet patches in the dust at his feet. He executed a rapid sequence of kinetic strikes against a wooden practice dummy, splintering the dense timber with the metal blade. The vision hit him, causing his muscles to lock instantly. Seknos dropped the broadsword. The heavy iron clattered loudly against the paving stones, ringing out in the cold mountain air. He gripped the sides of his head, processing the vivid images of the barcode tattoos and the violet energy weapon. He looked up at the cloud cover, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and registered the exact physical coordinates of the incoming mass. He turned on his heel and walked directly toward the temple armory to gather his travel gear. At the Temple of Knowledge, Tasha Rio knelt on the cold stone floor, tracing specific orbital charts on a wide flimsiplast scroll. She possessed pale blue skin, and her two long leku rested heavily over her shoulders. She wore the durable, tightly woven robes of a journeyer, layered over the fine, imported silk garments associated with the ruling families of Shikakwa. The projected energy pulse surged through the stone floor, traveling up her spine and causing her hands to tremble. Tasha gasped, knocking her heavy inkstone off the wooden desk. The black liquid pooled over the grey flagstones. The detailed vision of the dark warship and the tattooed man flooded her optic nerves. She calculated the specific coordinates of the impending arrival, logging the location in her physical memory. She rolled up the star charts, strapped a short iron blade to her hip, and walked out through the high arched doors of the archive. The atmospheric pressure across Tython dropped rapidly. The wind currents shifted direction abruptly, pulling massive volumes of air toward the deep chasm of the rift. Shaykoda steered her winged beast toward the coordinates, flying low over the trees. Seknos Wrath secured his heavy canvas pack to his shoulders and descended the steep mountain trails on foot. Tasha Rio navigated the dense forest paths, cutting away thick vines with her iron blade. The three journeyers abandoned their immediate physical studies, following the dense, vibrating pulse echoing through the crust of the green world. The local fauna retreated into deep burrows and hollow tree trunks, reacting to the sudden shift in the energy field. The temperature of the air increased steadily, carrying the sharp scent of burning atmospheric gases. The heavy friction of an immense mass entering the planet's gravitational pull caused the upper atmosphere to glow bright orange, drawing the three Jedi directly toward the impending point of impact. The Devourer breached Tython's upper atmosphere at an excessively high velocity. The heavy atmospheric pressure of the green world immediately counteracted the massive black hull of the Rakatan warship. The dark side energy, fueling the ship's hyperdrive motivators violently collided with the planet's deeply centered force alignment. The localized weather patterns collapsed instantly. Black clouds rapidly expanded across the continent, blocking out the sun and turning the sky dark gray. Purple lightning struck the exterior hull of the warship, overloading the navigation computers and causing the heavy repulsor engines to fail completely. The Devourer plummeted toward the deep tectonic chasm of the rift, scraping against the steep rock walls and shearing off massive sheets of black durasteel. The ship impacted the bottom of the gorge with enough kinetic force to trigger a localized groundquake, buckling the trees on the surface and shattering the stone foundations of nearby Jedi outposts. Inside the central engineering decks, the massive spherical containment chambers ruptured upon impact. The structural failure instantly killed thousands of force-sensitive slaves strapped to the internal bulkheads. The simultaneous, violent deaths of so many sensitive individuals released a massive, uncontrolled burst of raw bogan energy directly into Titan's atmosphere. The planet reacted immediately. A force storm of unprecedented scale erupted directly over the crash site. High-velocity winds carrying jagged debris and heavy hail tore through the valley, uprooting ancient trees and flattening the tall grass. Concentrated bolts of electrical energy struck the ground repeatedly, melting the soil into black glass and superheating the surrounding air. Sesh pulled his body from the burning wreckage of the Devourer. His black armor plating bore deep gouges, and wet blood soaked his dark hair. The bodies of Tulkar, the bridge crew, and the slave population lay crushed inside the shattered hull behind him. He stepped onto the wet, steaming mud of the Tithonian forest floor. The ambient bogan energy generated by the dying ship and the raging storm fed his physical strength, but the localized gravity and the dense atmospheric pressure slowed his movements. He ignited his violet foresaber, the high-pitched hiss cutting through the sound of the roaring wind, and scanned the tree line for immediate threats. Coda arrived at the crash site first, her winged ranker landing heavily on a rocky ridge above the smoking hull. She unhooked her iron blade from her belt and jumped down into the thick mud. Seknos Wrath sprinted through the dense brush moments later, his heavy broadsword gripped tightly in his hands, sweat pouring down his crimson face. Tasha Rio arrived from the opposite direction, her pale blue leku twitching as she registered the immense heat and the sharp smell of ozone. The three journeyers converged on the clearing, circling the tattooed human standing over the black wreckage. Zesh did not wait for verbal communication. He lunged forward, swinging his violet blade in a tight, kinetic arc. The combat moved rapidly across the wet terrain. Seknos Wrath met Zesh's strike, bringing his heavy iron broadsword up to block. The violet energy sliced straight through the thick metal, severing the top half of the broadsword and leaving a glowing, molten edge. Zesh drove a physical kick into Seknos's chest, throwing the heavy Titan backward into the mud. Coda swung her iron blade at Zesh's legs, forcing him to jump back. As Zesh retreated, Tasha Rio extended her hands, using a focused wave of kinetic force to lift heavy river stones and hurl them directly at his torso. Zesh deflected the stones with his energy blade, but the constant barrage forced him backward against the jagged metal of the crashed ship. Coda closed the distance, dropping her iron blade and tackling Zesh directly to the ground. They rolled through the mud, exchanging heavy physical blows. Zesh drove his elbow into Shay's jaw, but she maintained her grip on his wrist, twisting his arm sharply. The violet foresaber slipped from Zesh's gauntlet and landed in the wet grass. Shay reached out, grabbed the cylindrical hilt, and rolled away. Zesh immediately surged forward to retrieve his weapon, but a sudden, massive strike of purple lightning from the storm hit the ground directly between them. The concussive shockwave threw Zesh backward into the thick brush. Bleeding, disarmed, and disoriented by the heavy gravity, Zesh turned and sprinted deep into the Tithonian forest, leaving the three battered journeyers standing in the pouring rain, holding a weapon they completely failed to understand. Ranger patrols tracked Zesh through the dense mud and heavy brush of the Tithonian forest. They followed his deep footprints and the spots of fresh blood left on the broad fern leaves. The rangers surrounded him in a clearing, securing his wrists with thick iron binders and loading him onto a repulsor sled. They transported the bleeding, exhausted man to the floating pontoons of Marrakesh. Inside the open-air medical wards, healers washed the dried blood from his hair using wooden basins filled with sterilized salt water. They applied thick, pungent organic pastes to the deep lacerations along his ribs and wrapped his torso in tight linen bandages. Zesh lay flat on the elevated cot, his eyes tracking the movements of the healers. His heart rate remained completely steady, and his muscles lay slack against the mattress. He observed the unfamiliar environment, processing the scent of crushed kelp and the rhythmic sound of waves hitting the wooden docks. The temple masters gathered in the central stone chamber of Akarkesh to determine the exact placement of the prisoner. They sat on heavy granite benches, pulling their thick woven cloaks over their shoulders to ward off the chill of the high altitude. Shea Koda, Seknos Wrath, and Tasha Rio stood in the center of the room, presenting their physical accounts of the crashed warship and the intense Bogan energy radiating from the stranger. The masters noted the extreme physical damage to the surrounding valley and the lingering dark side residue clinging to Zesh's cells. They issued a direct physical mandate, ordering the guards to transport Zesh to the Dark Moon. Shea Koda stepped forward, raising her voice and tightening her hands into fists. She detailed the momentary drop in Zesh's aggressive energy during the fight, arguing for his retention on Tython to study his physical adaptation to the Ashla. The masters raised their hands in unison, silencing the young journeyer, and enforced their immediate ruling. Two rangers escorted Zesh up the metal ramp of an atmospheric transport ship. The engines burned white-hot, lifting the vessel through the thick cloud cover and propelling it across the vacuum of space. The transport landed on the jagged, volcanic surface of Bogan, crushing the brittle rock beneath its landing gear. The rangers pushed Zesh out onto the dark surface and immediately launched the ship back toward Tython. The ambient temperature on the moon instantly froze the sweat on Zesh's skin. He pulled his thin linen garments tight against his chest, his boots crunching over the loose basalt gravel. The air lacked oxygen density, forcing him to take rapid, shallow breaths. He walked across the shadowed craters, drawing heavily on the dark side energy, permeating the ground to generate internal body heat and keep his organs functioning. A figure emerged from the deep shadows of a rocky overhang. Dagon Locke stepped into the dim starlight, his heavy wool cloak severely frayed at the edges. His hair hung in matted strips around his gaunt, pale face. Locke stopped a few paces from Zesh, his eyes locking onto the thick black barcode tattoos etched across the man's forehead and cheeks. Locke's pupils dilated rapidly, and he took a sharp, audible breath. He pointed a dirt-stained finger directly at the heavy iron collar clamped around Zesh's neck. Locke stepped closer, inspecting the physical build of the Force Hound and the specific dark energy radiating from his skin. The exact physical details matched the carvings Locke had scraped into the crater walls over the past 7 standard years. Locke extended his hand, generating a localized spark of purple static electricity between his fingertips, demonstrating his own command of the Bogan energy to the newcomer. Locke began speaking rapidly, his voice raspy from disuse. He detailed the curved black warships, the heavy thermal weapons, and the massive slave containment chambers. Zesh listened to the accurate descriptions of the Infinite Empire, his jaw clenching tightly. Locke grabbed Zesh by the shoulder, pressing his fingertips deep into the muscle. He laid out a precise sequence of physical actions. They would construct a signal emitter from the debris scattered across the moon, hijack the next Jedi supply transport, and return to the green world below. Locke intended to march directly into the temple cities, rally the younger journeyers, and physically dismantle the current council. He required Zesh's specific knowledge of the invading technology to forge new weapons and prepare the Tython population for the inevitable arrival of the remaining Rakatan fleet. Shesh stared at the ragged man, recognizing the utility of an ally who understood his combat capabilities and shared his reliance on the dark energy. Back on the surface of Tython, Shae Coda sat alone in her quarters within Padawan Kesh. She placed the cylindrical metal hilt of the foresaber on the wooden table in front of her. She ran her fingers over the dark alloy, feeling the weight and the precise balance of the weapon. She pressed her thumb near the activation stud, examining the crystalline focusing lens housed inside the emitter matrix. She replayed the exact sequence of the physical confrontation in the mud, recalling the momentary hesitation in Zesh's eyes right before the lightning strike. She strapped her heavy canvas pack to her shoulders and secured her iron blade to her belt. She picked up the dark metal hilt, sliding it into a concealed pouch on her thigh. She walked out of the barracks and turned her boots toward the distant launch pads, calculating the exact fuel requirements to reach the dark moon. Shae Coda piloted a small atmospheric transport through the upper exosphere of Tython and crossed the vast stretch of open space toward the dark moon. The vessel featured a reinforced titanium hull and heavy thermal shielding designed to withstand Tython's volatile storms. She engaged the reverse thrusters, lowering the heavily armored chassis onto the jagged basalt ridges of Bogan. The landing gear crushed the brittle volcanic rock beneath it. Shae released her flight harness and lowered the heavy steel ramp. She stepped out into the freezing temperature of the moon, pulling her thick woven cloak tightly around her shoulders to retain her body heat. She detached the cylindrical metal hilt of the foresaber from her belt, gripping it firmly in her right gauntlet. She scanned the dusty ground, located 2 sets of deep boot prints in the dark soil, and followed the tracks down into a wide, shadowed crater. Sharp stalagmites rose from the basin floor, and fine grey ash clung to her boots with every step. At the bottom of the basin, Dagon, Locke and Zesh stood over a cluster of glowing thermal vents. Locke rubbed his bare hands over the rising steam to warm his pale skin. His fingernails were cracked and packed with dark dirt from years of surviving on the barren moon. Shae turned his head, his black barcode tattoos catching the faint starlight, and locked his eyes on Shae descending the rocky slope. Shae pressed the activation stud on the metal hilt. The violet energy blade ignited with a loud, high-pitched hiss, casting a purple glow across the crater walls. She leveled the tip of the weapon directly at Zesh's chest and stepped forward over the loose gravel. Zesh dropped into a low, physical combat stance, his muscles tensing under his linen bandages. Dagon Locke stepped between them, raising his hands and projecting a sudden, massive wave of kinetic energy. The invisible wall of force struck Shae directly in the sternum, lifting her off her feet and throwing her backward onto the sharp rocks. Her head snapped back against the basalt, and her vision flashed white. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs and forced her fingers to release the foresaber. The metal hilt deactivated and clattered across the stone floor. Zesh dove forward, grabbing the weapon and rolling back onto his feet. He ignited the violet blade and raised it toward Shae's neck. Locke placed a hand on Zesh's arm, pressing down physically to lower the weapon. Locke needed the transport ship resting on the ridge above them, and he required the access codes locked within Shae's flight computer. Locke walked over to Shae and knelt beside her on the cold ground. He placed his fingertips directly against her temples and pushed raw bogan energy into her cerebral cortex. He flooded her optic nerves with the exact visual projections he had witnessed for 7 standard years. Shay saw the massive black hulls of the Rakatan warships, the tall alien commanders with eyes on thick stalks, and the thousands of slaves chained to the spherical containment chambers. The rapid succession of intense images overloaded her physical nervous system. Her vision blurred, blood dripped from her nose, and she collapsed forward into the grey dust. Thais pulled heavy iron binders from the pockets of Locke's frayed cloak and secured Shay's wrists tightly behind her back. He hoisted the dazed journeyer over his armored shoulder and walked up the steep incline of the crater. Locke followed closely, picking up the discarded canvas packs and examining the surrounding sky for any incoming Jedi patrols. They reached the top of the ridge and carried Shay up the steel ramp of her transport ship. Zesh deposited her on the metal floor plates of the cargo hold and secured her ankles with thick leather straps. Locke stepped into the cockpit and initiated the pre-flight launch sequence. He flipped a series of heavy brass toggles and pushed the primary ignition levers forward. He activated the primary thrusters, vibrating the control panels under his hands. Plumes of blue plasma erupted from the engine exhaust, scorching the rocky ridge. Zesh stood behind the pilot's chair, clipping the violet foresaber to his belt and observing the green sphere of Tython through the thick, crystalline viewports. Locke adjusted the navigation dials, setting a direct flight path toward a remote sector of the Tythonian wilderness. He planned to fly well beneath the coverage of the sensor arrays maintained by the Temple Masters. He steered the transport away from the dark moon, accelerating rapidly through the black space. The ship descended into Tython's atmosphere, entering the deep, winding canyons of the planet's southern hemisphere, carrying the outcast, the Force Hound, and their captive toward a secluded forge buried deep within the rock. The transport ship descended into a narrow, vertical fissure in the Tythonian crust. The heavy titanium hull scraped against the jagged granite walls, shearing long strips of metal from the chassis and sending bright yellow sparks cascading down into the deep darkness. Dagon Locke pulled the heavy brass throttles backward, engaging the reverse repulsor lifts to slow their momentum. The ship settled heavily onto a wide, flat rock ledge overhanging a deep caldera of bubbling magma. The intense subterranean heat radiated upward, warping the air visible through the viewports and rapidly increasing the temperature of the ship's exterior plating. Locke depressed the release levers, and the heavy steel ramp lowered, resting directly on the hot basalt floor. Zesh hoisted Shay Koda over his shoulder and carried her down the heated ramp. He dropped her onto the hard stone surface near the edge of the magma pool. Locke walked over to a rusted iron wheel embedded deep in the cavern wall. He gripped the spokes with both hands and applied continuous physical force, turning the wheel and grinding a massive circular stone door open. The open doorway revealed a vast workspace. Heavy iron anvils rested on solid blocks of granite. Stacks of crude metal ingots sat on the floor, covered in thick layers of grey dust. Thick, jagged veins of luminous purple and green crystalline minerals protruded directly from the raw rock face of the cavern walls. Locke pointed to the crystal deposits embedded in the wall and then gestured directly to the violet foresaber clipped to Zesh's belt. Zesh unhooked the cylindrical hilt and placed it on a flat stone table in the center of the room. He used a small metal spanner to unscrew the base plate and slid the outer casing away from the internal mechanisms. He arranged the components in a straight line on the stone surface. He displayed the magnetic emitter ring, the twisted energy modulation wires, and the primary focusing crystal housed within a protective metal bracket. Locke picked up a heavy iron hammer and a steel chisel from a nearby rack. He walked to the cave wall, positioned the chisel against a cluster of raw purple crystals, and struck the metal head with the hammer. Sharp rock fragments flew outward as Locke fractured the stone, extracting 3 elongated crystal formations. He carried the raw minerals back to the stone table. Locke gripped a pair of long iron tongs, clamped them around a stack of salvaged durasteel plating, and lowered the metal directly into the glowing magma pool below the ledge. The metal heated rapidly, turning a bright, blinding yellow before melting into a liquid state. Locke pulled the tongs back and poured the molten steel into cylindrical clay molds resting on the cavern floor. Zesh physically guided Locke through the precise assembly process. They removed the cooled metal cylinders from the clay molds and filed the exterior surfaces smooth using coarse grinding stones. Locke placed the extracted crystals onto the flat stone table. He positioned his hands over the jagged facets, pressing his fingertips directly against the mineral surfaces. He channeled raw Bogan energy from his own cells directly into the crystalline structure. The heavy application of dark side kinetic force caused the crystals to vibrate violently against the stone table. The internal structure of the minerals fractured and realigned under the pressure, shifting their color from a translucent purple to a deep, dense crimson. Shaykoda lay on the basalt ledge, her wrists bound securely behind her back by the iron cuffs. She watched Locke manipulate the crystals on the table. She observed the heavy drops of sweat pooling on his forehead and running down the sides of his face. She tracked the thick, dark veins bulging along his neck as he sustained the high-pressure flow of Bogan energy. She watched him pick up one of the attuned crimson crystals with metal tweezers, lower it into the center of the filed metal hilt, and secure the magnetic emitter ring over the top. Locke applied a high-heat soldering torch to the modulation wires, sealing the circuitry with drops of molten lead. Locke threaded the final base plate onto the bottom of the cylinder and tightened it with the spanner. He stood up straight, wiping the sweat from his eyes, and gripped the newly forged weapon in his right hand. He pressed his thumb against the activation stud. A loud, sharp hiss echoed off the cavern walls. A long blade of contained crimson dark side energy extended vertically from the emitter, casting a bright red glow across Locke's pale face. Locke stepped toward one of the heavy iron anvils and swung the weapon in a rapid horizontal arc. The crimson energy severed the top half of the solid iron block completely. The heavy piece of cut metal slid off the base and slammed onto the floor, the sliced edges glowing bright orange and filling the room with the smell of melting slag. Zesh reassembled his own violet weapon and clipped it to his belt. Locke extinguished the crimson blade, securing the new hilt to his waist. He walked back to the work table, grabbing more empty clay molds and heavy iron tongs. He instructed Zesh to extract more crystals from the cave walls. They began melting more durasteel and attuning multiple crystals in rapid succession, repeating the precise manufacturing steps. They lined the perimeter of the stone table with freshly assembled metal hilts, mass-producing the energy weapons to supply the Tython population for the impending terrestrial war. Dajan Locke stepped out of the subterranean forge and dragged Shaykoda to her feet. He removed the iron binders from her wrists and handed her the newly constructed crimson foresaber. Locke ignited his own weapon, the red beam casting long shadows against the basalt walls. He ordered Shay to ignite her blade and strike him. Shay hesitated, her fingers slipping on the heavy metal hilt. Lok advanced rapidly, swinging his weapon in a series of harsh, kinetic arcs that forced Shay backward onto the uneven ground. He repeatedly demonstrated the required physical technique, utilizing the raw bogan energy generated by the active magma pool to increase his muscular output and the speed of his strikes. He instructed her to feed her residual anger over the despot war directly into the focusing crystal. Shay clenched her jaw, tightened her grip, and engaged the blade. She pushed back against Lok's heavy blows, the crimson energy blades colliding with loud, sharp crackles that showered the rock floor with sparks. While Lok trained the captive journeyer, Zesh focused on the transport ship. He carried armfuls of raw ore from the cave walls and deposited them into the cargo hold. He utilized his specific knowledge of Rakatan technology to physically modify the ship's communication array. He stripped the heavy insulation from the internal wiring, splicing the command modules directly into the long-range sublight transmitters. Zesh created a dense, encrypted tracking beacon designed specifically to penetrate the heavy radiation interference of the deep core. He entered the exact planetary coordinates of Tython into the modified transmitter and activated the continuous looping signal, ensuring that Predor Skalnas and the remaining Rakatan fleet could easily locate the isolated system. High in the stone chambers of Akar Kesh, the temple masters registered the missing transport and the absence of the 3 journeyers. They monitored the deep atmospheric disturbances moving across the southern hemisphere. They tracked the distinct, concentrated spikes of bogan energy emanating from the remote canyons. The masters mobilized the ranger patrols, loading heavy squads into reinforced repulsor craft and flying them directly toward the source of the disturbance. Seknos Wrath and Tasha Rio stood at the front of the transport bays, gripping their iron weapons and guiding the pilots toward the specific coordinates they had logged during their initial physical visions. The Jedi transports descended into the deep canyon, the downdraft from their engines kicking up thick clouds of grey ash. The Rangers dropped the landing ramps and swarmed the basalt ledge. Dagon Lok stood in the center of the open forge, holding his crimson blade alongside Shay Koda and Zesh. The Rangers immediately identified the unauthorized energy weapons and the extreme physical threat posed by the tattooed stranger. The combat initiated without verbal commands. The Rangers rushed the ledge, swinging their heavy iron broadswords. Lok and Zesh parried the physical strikes, using the concentrated heat of the Force's sabers to slice completely through the forged metal. Shay Koda utilized her newly trained bogan techniques, physically disarming the advancing Rangers with rapid kinetic kicks and blunt force trauma to their joints. During the engagement, Seknos Wrath pushed past the front line of the Rangers, his red skin slick with sweat. He locked eyes with Zesh and lunged forward, tackling the Force Hound directly into the rocky wall of the cavern. The 2 men exchanged heavy physical blows, their knuckles cracking against jawbones and heavy armor plating. Zesh drove his knee into Seknos's ribs, creating a sharp physical crack that echoed in the enclosed space. Tasha Rio moved to intercept Lok, using her physical momentum to drive him back toward the edge of the magma pool. Lok blocked her strikes effortlessly, twisting his crimson blade to scorch the fabric of her heavy robes. The intense heat of the forge and the continuous exertion drained the stamina of the Jedi forces. The Temple Masters arrived on the ledge, projecting massive, synchronized waves of Ashla energy. The dense, physical wall of calm force washed over the combatants. The sudden influx of balanced energy disrupted the active focus required to maintain the bogan alignment. The crimson and violet blades flickered and deactivated, the metal hilts falling completely inert. The sudden drop in adrenaline caused Locke, Zesh, and Shay to collapse onto their knees, their muscles trembling violently. The Rangers stepped forward, securing the three individuals with heavy iron binders and confiscating the dismantled weapons. They loaded the prisoners onto the transports and ascended out of the deep canyon, returning to the stone courtyards to face the absolute judgment of the unified council. The temple masters confined Dagon, Locke, and Sesh within the high stone walls of Akarkesh. They placed the prisoners in separate, windowless holding cells, securing the thick timber doors with heavy iron drop bars. The cells contained only low wooden cots and small water basins. The masters stationed 4 armed rangers outside each door, instructing them to maintain strict physical silence and absolute ashlar focus to neutralize any bogan energy spikes emanating from the captives. Shay Koda remained under close observation in the medical wards of Padawan Kesh, recovering from the localized physical trauma of Locke's kinetic strikes and the severe neurological strain of his forced visual projection. Inside his cell, Zesh paced the cold flagstones. He tracked the precise movements of the guards outside his door, analyzing the slight scraping of their leather boots against the stone. He measured the exact thickness of the timber walls by striking the wood with his knuckles and listening to the resulting resonance. Without his foresaber or access to raw bogan energy, Zesh relied completely on his physical conditioning. He executed rapid sequences of strikes against the solid stone blocks of the cell, conditioning his joints and callousing his skin. He recognized the tactical disadvantage of his current position. He possessed no allies among the Tython population, and his continuous looping transmission guaranteed the eventual arrival of the Infinite Empire. Dagon Locke sat cross-legged on the floor of his own cell. He did not test the physical strength of the walls or attempt to engage the guards. He closed his eyes, slowed his breathing, and focused entirely on the internal alignment of his energy. He completely abandoned the chaotic, aggressive surges he used on the dark moon, actively transitioning his physical state back toward the center point of the Jedi philosophy. He lowered his heart rate, relaxed his facial muscles, and drew on the calm, passive current of the ashlar. He required access to the council, and the masters only engaged with individuals demonstrating complete equilibrium. Locke suppressed the vivid images of the Rakatan warships, pushing the dark side residue out of his cells and allowing the steady hum of Tython to flow through his body. After 3 standard planetary rotations, the Temple Masters detected the physical shift in Locke's energy signature. They removed the iron drop bar and escorted Locke into the central circular chamber. Locke stood before the council, his posture relaxed and his breathing even. He did not raise his voice or project his anger. He detailed the specific modifications Gesh made to the transport's communication array and outlined the exact technical specifications of the long-range transmission. He explained that the Infinite Empire utilized biological dark side energy to navigate the deep core, and that Gesh's specific frequency would guide the massive black warships directly through the radiation storms. Locke presented a clear physical timeline. The Rakatan fleet possessed the coordinates, they possessed the hyperdrive technology, and their arrival in the Tython system was an unavoidable physical certainty. The Masters observed Locke's stable condition. They cross-referenced his technical descriptions with the specific physical anomalies they previously recorded from the wreckage of the Devourer. The details of the biological containment chambers and the dark side energy drives matched the physical evidence extracted from the crashed hull. The Council acknowledged the high probability of Locke's assessment. They authorized immediate physical preparations across the temple cities. The masters dispatched messengers to the settled worlds, instructing the ruling families of Shikakwa to mobilize their sublight freighters and load their heavy artillery. They commanded the foundries of Stav Kesh to increase their production of iron blades and heavy armor plating. Lok requested immediate access to the subterranean forge and the raw crystal deposits. He explained that the Jedi's standard iron weapons would fail completely against the Rakatan troops. The invaders wore high-density armor and utilized advanced energy shields. The Tythons required weapons capable of matching the extreme thermal output of the Forsaber. Lok offered to train the Rangers in the precise physical techniques required to construct and wield the energy blades, leveraging his direct experience with Xesh. The Masters weighed the tactical necessity against the extreme risk of utilizing Bogan energy. They recognized the severe physical disadvantage of their current arsenal and approved Lok's request, prioritizing the immediate survival of the Tython system over their strict adherence to passive combat forms. The Jedi Order mobilized. Transports moved continuously between the temple cities, transporting raw metal ingots and heavy forging tools to the deep canyon. Rangers abandoned their standard patrol routes, gathering on the basalt ledges to extract the purple and green crystals from the rock walls. Dagon Lok stood at the center of the operation, instructing the Tythons on the specific application of kinetic force required to align the internal structures of the minerals. The subterranean workspace, filled with the constant heat of melting durasteel and the sharp, high-pitched hiss of igniting energy blades. The Tythons discarded their iron broadswords, gripping the cylindrical metal hilts of the Forsabers, preparing their bodies for the violent physical realities of the coming war. The Temple Masters designated Dagon Lok as the primary military commander of the Jedi forces. Lok immediately ordered the construction of heavy fortifications around the perimeters of the 9 temple cities. Rangers dragged massive granite boulders from the quarries, stacking them into thick defensive walls. They positioned the newly forged Forsabers on heavy wooden racks inside the armories, continuously checking the magnetic emitter rings and the charge levels of the focusing crystals. Gesh remained under close guard in the subterranean forge, physically separated from the main Tython population. The Masters utilized his specific knowledge to construct heavy sublight cannons, welding the massive artillery batteries directly onto the stone battlements of Akar Kesh and Stav Kesh. During the frantic preparations, localized atmospheric disturbances registered across the Tython system. The tracking beacon Zeesh, installed on the transport ship, completed its transmission cycle. Predor Skalnas and the remaining fleet of the Infinite Empire dropped out of hyperspace directly over the green world. Hundreds of curved, black warships filled the sky, blocking the starlight and projecting massive, dense shadows across the Tythonian continents. The sheer volume of concentrated Bogan energy fueling the Rakatan hyperdrives triggered an immediate physical reaction from the planet. Severe groundquakes cracked the bedrock beneath the temple cities, shattering the freshly constructed defensive walls. The temperature of the air dropped rapidly, and violent force storms ripped across the atmosphere, tearing the heavy wooden roofs off the barracks at Padawan Kesh. The Rakatan warships lowered their altitude, hovering directly over the major Tython settlements. The black hulls opened, deploying thousands of heavily armored dropships. The dropships landed violently in the thick mud of the forests and the packed dirt of the temple courtyards. Rakatan soldiers, standing 2 meters tall with thick amphibian skin, marched down the steel ramps. They carried heavy thermal blasters, firing concentrated beams of superheated energy that melted the granite blocks of the temple walls and ignited the surrounding vegetation. Hundreds of force hounds, wearing heavy iron collars and bearing thick black barcode tattoos, moved ahead of the main infantry lines. The hounds ignited violet force sabers, using their physical mastery of the Bogan energy to deflect the Tython's kinetic strikes and sever their wooden staffs. Dagon Lok stood on the stone battlements of Stav Kesh, gripping his crimson foresaber. He watched the Rakatan forces advance up the steep mountain trails, their thermal blasts melting the frost on the rocks. Lok issued rapid verbal commands, directing the rangers to engage the hounds in close-quarters combat. Seknos Wrath charged down the mountain path, his red skin contrasting sharply with the grey ash falling from the sky. He swung his crimson blade, blocking the incoming violet strikes and driving his heavy boots into the armored chests of the Rakatan soldiers. Shea Koda and Tasha Rio fought alongside him, utilizing the aggressive physical techniques Lok had demonstrated in the forge. They channeled their adrenaline directly into their focusing crystals, cutting through the dense Rakatan armor and leaving the charred bodies of the invaders in the mud. The combat spread across the entire Tython system. The ruling families of Shikakwa launched their retrofitted freighters, engaging the massive black warships in the upper atmosphere. The heavy artillery cannons fired continuously, exchanging raw thermal energy in the cold vacuum of space. The Tythons on Kalamar and Fury's Gate deployed their industrial mining equipment, using heavy repulsor drills and plasma cutters to tear through the hulls of the landed dropships. The entire system mobilized, fighting a massive, coordinated war of attrition against the Infinite Empire. Despite the heavy resistance, the Rakatan forces maintained their strict, overwhelming numerical advantage. Predor Skalnas directed the main assault toward Akar Kesh. He recognized the massive stone monolith as the physical center of the planet's energy field. The black warships bombarded the Temple of Balance from the air, raining heavy plasma blasts down onto the polished stone floors. The 8 rivers flowing from the summit boiled rapidly, turning to thick white steam. The temple masters stood around the central hearth, combining their physical efforts to project a massive wave of Ashla energy into the sky. They attempted to neutralize the concentrated Bogan energy of the Rakatan fleet, pushing back against the dark side pressure with extreme physical exertion. The sheer volume of the opposing energy caused the blood vessels in their eyes to rupture, and blood dripped slowly from their noses onto the stone floor. Dagon Lok forced the massive granite doors of Akar Kesh open. He walked into the central chamber, his boots stepping through the pooled blood of the temple masters. The elders lay collapsed around the central hearth, their breathing shallow and their heart rates dangerously low from the extreme physical strain of projecting the continuous Ashla wave. Lok ignited his crimson foresaber, the red light reflecting off the polished stone floor. He stood over the exhausted masters and formally seized command of the Jedi Order. He did not ask for their consensus. He immediately dictated rapid logistical shifts, redirecting the surviving ranger patrols from the deep forests directly to the front lines of the besieged temple cities. He ordered the remaining reserves of raw ore transported instantly to the subterranean forge to equip the influx of new fighters. Tsesh stood beside Lok, watching the temple masters on the floor. His violet blade hummed steadily in his right gauntlet. The constant exposure to the intense Bogan energy of the Rakatan invasion triggered distinct physical reactions within his body. The deep burn in his chest, usually associated with his conditioning under Predor Tulkar, lessened significantly. He observed Lok's aggressive tactical commands and recognized a direct parallel to the Rakatan military structure. Yet Lok did not utilize the heavy iron collars or the electrical shocks. Tsesh processed this distinction, adjusting his grip on the metal hilt. He stepped forward and provided the Jedi with specific technical details regarding the Rakatan command structure, identifying the precise atmospheric coordinates of Predor Skalnaz's flagship. Shea Koda, Seknos Wrath, and Tasha Rio arrived at Akar-Kesh, carrying the heavy iron binders they had previously used to restrain the two men. They found Locke standing over the council and Zesh analyzing a localized holographic projection of the Tython system. The three journeyers dropped the binders onto the floor. They possessed deep physical exhaustion, their heavy woven robes caked in wet mud and charred by thermal blasts. They acknowledged the immediate tactical necessity of Locke's command. Seknos Wrath requested a crimson foresaber, gripping the hilt and igniting the red blade to replace his shattered broadsword. Shea Koda stood near Jesh, noting the absence of his usual tense, rigid posture. She requested the specific entry codes for the Rakatan dropships, intending to bypass their heavy exterior shielding during the next planetary assault. The organized Tython resistance fractured the Infinite Empire's initial offensive. The Rangers, armed with the new energy weapons, successfully matched the extreme thermal output of the Rakatan infantry. They fought in the narrow stone corridors of Anil-Kesh and the open courtyards of Bodhi, using the crimson and violet blades to sever the heavy durasteel armor plating of the invaders. The physical combat shifted from coordinated defensive lines to isolated, brutal engagements in the thick mud. The Jedi pushed the Rakatan ground forces back toward their dropships, utilizing sudden kinetic strikes to throw the tall amphibian soldiers off the high mountain ridges and into the deep chasms below. Predor Skalnas registered the unexpected resistance through the tactical displays on his command deck. He noted the specific energy signatures of the Tython weapons, recognizing the underlying technology. He turned to Trill, the female forcehound standing behind him. Skalnas observed the physical tremors in her hands and the dark blood crusted under her nose. He ordered her to descend to the planet's surface immediately. He tasked her with locating Zesh and eliminating him, identifying the rogue hound as the primary source of the Tython's rapid technological adaptation. Trill secured a heavy thermal blaster to her thigh, ignited her own violet foresaber, and boarded a high-velocity dropship. She descended through the thick cloud cover of Tython, tracking the distinct, familiar physical pulse of Zesh's specific Bogan energy signature through the chaotic noise of the ongoing planetary war. Trill piloted the Rakatan dropship directly into the lower atmosphere of Tython. The heavy friction burned the outer hull plating, and extreme turbulence rattled the flight console. She ignored the warning alarms, pushing the thrusters to maximum output and maintaining a steep angle of descent. She tracked the precise Bogan signature radiating from Zesh, isolating his specific physical frequency from the chaotic dark side energy filling the surrounding airspace. The dropship cleared the thick cloud cover, leveling out over the deep forest. Trill activated the repulsor lifts and deployed the landing gear, crushing the tops of the ancient trees as she brought the heavy vessel down onto a muddy ridge overlooking Akar-Kesh. Trill unhooked her flight harness and stepped out onto the metal ramp. She wiped a fresh streak of blood from her upper lip, her breathing shallow from the intense cerebral pressure of tracking Zesh through the planetary storms. She ignited her violet foresaber and descended the ridge on foot, moving toward the base of the massive stone monolith. The air around the temple city smelled of superheated steam and charred flesh. Heavy artillery fire struck the stone battlements above her, sending massive chunks of granite crashing down into the mud. Trill ignored the surrounding combat, keeping her physical focus entirely on the energy signature, pulling her toward the central chamber. Inside Akar-Kesh, Sesh stood beside Dagon Locke. He observed the tactical holograms, identifying a localized weakness in the shielding of a Rakatan cruiser hovering over the northern mountain range. Suddenly, the deep burn in his chest flared, and the muscles in his jaw locked. He recognized the specific physical approach of another force hound. Zesh drew his violet blade, the high-pitched hiss echoing against the high stone ceiling, and turned toward the massive granite doors. Trill walked through the archway, her heavy boots leaving muddy tracks on the polished floor. She leveled her foresaber directly at Zesh's chest, her eyes wide and the black barcode tattoos stretching tight across her cheeks. The engagement initiated without hesitation. Trill lunged forward, swinging her blade in a rapid, heavy arc. Zesh raised his weapon, the two violet energy fields colliding with a sharp crack that illuminated the dark chamber. Zesh absorbed the kinetic impact, shifting his weight backward and deflecting the strike away from his torso. Trill maintained the offensive pressure, executing a series of rapid thrusts and heavy overhand chops. She utilized the raw Bogan energy to increase her physical speed, attempting to overwhelm Jesh through sheer momentum. Jesh parried the strikes, matching her rhythm and analyzing her footwork. He identified the slight tremors in her hands and the visible exhaustion in her posture, physical markers of the severe neurological strain she endured to locate him. Shakoda entered the chamber, gripping her crimson foresaber. She observed the two hounds locked in combat, the violent flashes of purple light reflecting off the stone walls. She ignited her red blade and moved to flank Trill. Sesh raised his free hand, pushing a sharp wave of kinetic force against Shay's chest to halt her advance. He maintained his visual lock on Trill, communicating silently that this specific physical confrontation required his sole participation. Shay lowered her weapon, stepping back and watching the exchange. Trill swung her blade low, attempting to sever Zesh's legs. Zesh jumped, clearing the energy beam, and drove his heavy boot directly into Trill's sternum. The impact threw her backward onto the hard flagstones. Trill rolled, deactivated her weapon, and threw a heavy, localized burst of purple lightning from her fingertips. Zesh caught the electrical charge with his blade, grounding the energy into the stone floor. He stepped forward, raising his weapon to deliver the final kinetic strike, preparing to sever Trill's head from her shoulders. Zesh stepped toward Trill, gripping the hilt of his violet foresaber. He kept his elbows tucked close to his ribs, moving with measured, precise steps across the flagstones. Trill braced herself against the floor, her chest heaving as she pushed herself up to a kneeling position. Blood dripped continuously from her nose, pooling on the polished stone between them. She reached toward her thigh, unholstering the heavy thermal blaster, and pointed the barrel directly at Zesh. Before she could pull the trigger, Zesh executed a rapid physical kick, striking her wrist and knocking the blaster across the room. He raised his violet blade, angling the glowing energy directly over her exposed neck. He held the weapon steady, the high-pitched hum of the crystal vibrating in the enclosed space. He did not execute the strike. He maintained his stance, looking directly at the dark barcode tattoos marking her face. Trill stared up at the glowing blade, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She anticipated the physical execution mandated by their training. She waited for the smell of burnt carbon and the sudden, total cessation of physical sensation. The strike did not come. The deep, ingrained conditioning that dictated every action within the Infinite Empire failed to override the sudden physical stillness in Zesh's muscles. He recognized the heavy iron collar clamped around Trill's neck, the identical biological mechanism designed to channel pain into raw fuel. He recalled the specific physical relief he experienced when he first detected Tython's centered energy field, the sudden drop in his heart rate, and the absence of the constant adrenaline burn. He lowered his force-saber, deactivating the blade and clipping the metal hilt back onto his belt. Dagon Locke moved forward, stepping into Zesh's peripheral vision. Locke grabbed Zesh by the shoulder armor, turning him around physically. Locke demanded the execution, citing the immediate tactical threat Trill posed to the Temple of Balance. He pointed his crimson blade at the kneeling hound, insisting that her specific knowledge of Tython's coordinates presented an unacceptable risk to the system. Zesh pulled away from Locke's grip, using a focused kinetic push to drive the Tython commander back several paces. Zesh stated his refusal clearly, indicating the heavy iron collar around Trill's throat. He explained that she was a biological component of the Rakatan war machine, physically compelled to execute orders under the threat of severe neurological pain. Shea Coda observed the confrontation. She stepped past Locke, keeping her crimson blade ignited, and approached the kneeling hound. She knelt down next to Trill, inspecting the heavy iron lock securing the collar. She applied the tip of her energy blade directly to the locking mechanism, using precise, focused heat to melt the internal tumblers without scorching the skin underneath. The heavy iron collar popped open and clattered heavily onto the stone floor. Trill gasped, her hands immediately flying to her throat to rub the burned, raw skin. Shea offered her hand, pulling the exhausted hound to her feet. Sayesh registered the physical removal of the control mechanism. He noted the sudden shift in Trill's posture, the release of the deep tension in her shoulders. The heavy stone doors of the chamber rattled violently. A massive explosion shook the foundation of Akar-Kesh, knocking dust and loose mortar from the high ceiling. The temple masters, recovering near the central hearth, stood up slowly, gripping the edges of the stone benches for support. The synchronized wave of Ashlar energy they projected had momentarily stalled the Rakatan bombardment, but the sheer volume of incoming thermal blasts was overwhelming the structural integrity of the temple walls. Zesh turned to Locke and the temple masters, delivering rapid tactical assessments. He detailed the specific shielding frequencies utilized by the black warships hovering overhead. He explained that the Infinite Empire's thermal blasters drew their power directly from the dark side containment chambers located in the central engineering decks. To dismantle the invasion force, the Tythons needed to target the biological batteries fueling the fleet. Shea Coda nodded, indicating the access codes she had requested earlier. She presented a direct physical strategy. Utilize the captured dropship Trill had arrived in to bypass the localized orbital shielding and insert a strike team directly into the flagship of Predor Skalnas. Locke accepted the tactical logic. He deactivated his crimson blade, assembling a squad of rangers and journeyers, preparing to launch a concentrated physical assault directly into the heart of the Rakatan fleet. Dagon Locke assembled a strike team consisting of Zesh, Shea Coda, Seknos Wrath, and Tasha Rio. They ran out of Akar-Kesh into the pouring rain, splashing through the deep mud toward the heavy Rakatan dropship resting on the ridge. Trill followed closely behind Zesh, rubbing the raw, red skin around her neck where the iron collar had sat. They boarded the black Durasteel vessel, and Trill took the pilot's seat. She engaged the primary repulsor lifts and punched the precise clearance codes into the navigation computer. The dropship lifted off the ground, ascending rapidly through the lower atmosphere and passing completely undetected through the heavy energy shielding surrounding the Rakatan flagship. The dropship clamped onto the hangar bay of the massive black cruiser. The heavy metal doors hissed open, and the strike team stepped onto the polished black floor plates of the enemy vessel. The interior air tasted metallic, laced with the sharp smell of sulfur and burning biological material. Trill led the group through the wide, dimly lit corridors. They utilized physical kinetic strikes to drop the Rakatan guards they encountered, snapping their necks before they could raise their thermal blasters. The team descended through the ship's primary levels, moving directly toward the central engineering decks. They reached the massive containment chamber. Thousands of chained, emaciated slaves hung from heavy iron hooks, their bodies writhing as the mechanical pins extracted their biological energy. The air in the room vibrated with a continuous, low-frequency thrum that resonated in the Titan's teeth. Locke ordered the team to dismantle the extraction systems. Zesh and Shea Koda ignited their forces sabers, slicing through the thick power cables and shattering the physical control consoles. Seknos Wrath utilized his raw physical strength to bend the iron hooks, lowering the exhausted slaves to the floor grates. The immediate disruption of the biological fuel source caused the bright red tactical lights throughout the ship to flicker violently. The massive hyperdrive engines sputtered, and the deck plates shuddered beneath their boots. Predor Skalnas entered the engineering deck, flanked by 24 heavily armored Rakatan soldiers. Skalnas carried an oversized, double-bladed violet force-saber, and his heavy claws scratched the metal floor as he walked. He observed Trill standing alongside the Titans, identifying the missing iron collar around her neck. He leveled his weapon at her, shouting guttural commands. The Rakatan soldiers raised their thermal blasters and opened fire. The Titans scattered, using the heavy containment spheres for cover as superheated plasma melted the surrounding metal grates. Locke charged Skalnas directly, swinging his crimson blade in a heavy, horizontal arc. Skalnas blocked the strike effortlessly, using his superior height and physical strength to drive Locke backward. The dark side energy radiating from Skalnas was immense, a heavy, suffocating pressure that restricted Locke's breathing. Skalnas recognized the specific physical output of the Predor. He sprinted across the deck, leaping over a ruptured console, and brought his violet blade down hard against Skalnas's weapon. The collision of the 3 energy blades threw off bright, blinding sparks. Skalnas bared his sharp teeth, leaning his heavy weight into the bind and forcing both Locke and Zesh down onto one knee. Trill moved to flank the Rakatan commander. She did not ignite a weapon. She approached Skalnas from behind, grabbing the thick, fleshy stalks supporting his eyes. She channeled her raw bogan energy directly into his optic nerves, utilizing the precise torture techniques she had endured during her conditioning. Skalnas roared, thrashing wildly to dislodge her. He swung his double-bladed weapon backward, entirely missing Trill but severely burning his own armored shoulder. Zesh capitalized on the distraction. He drove his heavy boot into Skalnas's kneecap, causing the joint to snap backward with a loud crack. As Skalnas collapsed onto the metal grating, Zesh drove his violet blade straight down, piercing the heavy black armor and penetrating the Predor's chest cavity. The death of the Rakatan commander triggered a complete collapse of the flagship's command structure. The remaining soldiers broke formation, abandoning their thermal weapons and fleeing the engineering deck. The power failure cascaded through the ship's primary systems. The heavy durasteel bulkheads groaned as the vessel lost altitude, plummeting through Tython's upper atmosphere. The strike team rushed the surviving slaves onto the captured dropship, packing them tightly into the cargo hold. Trill engaged the launch thrusters, tearing the smaller vessel away from the falling cruiser just as the massive black ship slammed into the Southern Ocean, generating a massive tidal wave that swallowed the burning wreckage. The destruction of Predor Skalnas's flagship disrupted the Infinite Empire's strict chain of command. The remaining Rakatan cruisers broke their precise orbital formations above Tython, maneuvering erratically as their localized shielding arrays powered down. Tython freighters from Kalimar and Shikakwa targeted the exposed engines of the drifting warships, firing concentrated artillery bursts that tore through the black durasteel hulls. The resulting secondary explosions ignited the onboard containment chambers, sending massive shockwaves across the upper atmosphere. The surviving Rakatan dropships on the surface immediately aborted their ground assaults. The amphibian soldiers retreated up the steel ramps, abandoning their heavy thermal blasters in the mud. They launched their vessels vertically, breaking atmosphere and engaging their hyperdrives to flee the Tython system, leaving the ruined remains of their fleet, burning in the deep oceans and scattered across the mountain ridges. Dagon Lok, Sesh, and the strike team landed their captured dropship in the packed dirt courtyard of Akar Kesh. Rangers and temple masters surrounded the landing zone, their heavy woven robes stained with soot and their physical movements slow from deep physical exhaustion. Lok lowered the landing ramp and walked down into the courtyard, clipping his deactivated crimson foresaber to his belt. He did not relinquish his command. He addressed the gathered Jedi, pointing directly to the heavy thermal burns on the stone walls and the thick black smoke rising from the surrounding forests. He outlined the immediate logistical requirements for system-wide recovery. He instructed the temple masters to redirect all available medical supplies to Maharakesh and ordered the foundries at Stavkesh to continue mass-producing energy weapons. He stated clearly that the Infinite Empire would eventually reconsolidate its forces, and the Tythons needed to maintain an active, aggressive military posture to survive the inevitable reprisal. The Temple Masters observed Lok's physical condition. They noted his rigid posture, the rapid pulse visible in his neck, and the heavy residue of dark side energy clinging to his cells. The Masters recognized the physical necessity of his tactical commands during the invasion, but they firmly rejected his permanent military authority. The Temple Master of Bodhi stepped forward, demanding Lok surrender his weapon and submit to the physical parameters of the Jedi Code. Lok refused. He drew his crimson blade, the loud hiss cutting through the quiet courtyard. He declared the traditional philosophy of perfect balance entirely obsolete, asserting that the Tythons required the absolute power of the Bogan to secure their physical existence against the galaxy. Seknos Wrath stood behind Lok, his red skin heavily bruised from the combat. He ignited his own crimson blade and stepped up beside the former prisoner. He agreed with Lok's assessment, physically aligning himself against the council. Tasha Rio and Shea Koda moved to the opposite side of the courtyard, unhooking their heavy iron blades and standing with the temple masters. The philosophical fracture divided the assembled Jedi immediately. Rangers and journeyers drew their respective weapons, choosing sides based on their physical experiences during the war. Those who relied heavily on the aggressive energy to survive the Rakatan infantry ignited red and violet force-sabers, stepping behind Lok. Those who maintained their physical center during the bombardments raised their iron swords and wooden staffs, standing firmly with the temple masters. Xesh and Trill stood near the metal ramp of the dropship, watching the Tythons align against each other. The two force hounds recognized the physical manifestation of a civil war. Zacius observed the heavy, chaotic mix of Ashla and Bogan energies accumulating in the courtyard. The localized atmospheric pressure dropped rapidly, and dark storm clouds began to gather directly above the stone monolith of Akar Kesh. Xesh turned to Trill, noting her exhausted posture and the dark burn marks around her throat. He pointed toward the open hatch of the Rakatan dropship. They had survived the Infinite Empire and witnessed the fracture of the Jedi Order. Sesh walked up the steel ramp, leading Trill into the dark interior of the vessel. He secured the airlock and engaged the repulsor lifts, piloting the captured ship away from the gathering storm and leaving the Tithans to resolve their internal conflict on the scarred surface of the green world. The physical confrontation in the stone courtyard of Akar Kesh expanded rapidly across the entire Tithonian continent. The scattered skirmishes escalated into a system-wide planetary conflict. The combatants designated this 10-year period of continuous military engagement as the Force Wars. Dagon Locke and Seknos Wrath commanded the faction fully committed to the dark side energy. These individuals retreated to the high northern peaks and fortified the stone walls of Stav Kesh. They monopolized the subterranean forges, utilizing the magma pools to manufacture hundreds of Crimson Forces Abers. They distributed these high-heat energy weapons to their recruits and marched back down into the deep forests. The Bogan followers utilized heavy kinetic blasts to shatter the granite outposts of their former allies. They sustained their physical stamina during long infantry marches by maintaining elevated heart rates, increasing their adrenaline production, and focusing entirely on aggressive combat impulses. This continuous channeling of raw dark side energy warped their physical appearance over the course of the war. Their skin grew pale and stretched tightly over their bones, thick dark veins bulged along their necks, and their pupils dilated permanently, reflecting the harsh red light of their ignited weapons. The opposing faction committed entirely and exclusively to the Ashla. They consolidated their remaining forces within the dense tree lines surrounding Calith and the floating pontoons of Maharakesh. They observed the rapid cellular degradation of the Bogan users and systematically discarded the dark side energy blades. To counter the extreme thermal output of the Forces Abers, the Ashla followers developed new metallurgical techniques. They gathered in smaller, localized forges, heating raw durasteel and folding the metal layers repeatedly with heavy hammers. As the metal cooled, the masters placed their hands over the anvils and projected steady, passive light-side energy directly into the iron. This process altered the molecular density of the weapons, creating glowing, physical broadswords capable of withstanding direct contact with the crimson plasma blades. They distributed these force-forged swords to their frontline fighters and reinforced their defensive perimeters. The physical realities of the prolonged conflict degraded the combatants in both armies. The heavy woven cloaks tore on the dense underbrush and deteriorated into mud-stained rags. Constant exposure to the elements rusted the standard iron armor plating and jammed the mechanical joints of the supply transports. Warriors wrapped their bleeding hands in strips of cured leather and utilized thick bone fragments scavenged from dead Tithonian raptors to replace shattered tool handles. They engaged in close-quarters combat in the flooded trenches outside Padawan Kesh, stepping over the submerged corpses of their former instructors. During a massive naval assault on the deep ocean, Locke's forces fired heavy artillery cannons into the buoyant wooden pontoons of Maharakesh. The explosive charges shattered the structural tethers, sinking the entire Temple of Healing into the freezing, dark salt water. The air across the continent smelled permanently of wet ash, decaying organic matter, and superheated ozone. The massive planetary divergence in energy destabilized the physical environment of the green world. Thick, dense gray cloud cover permanently blocked the starlight and obscured the twin moons. Heavy rain fell continuously for months, flooding the wide river basins and washing away the packed dirt trails connecting the temple cities. Violent tectonic shifts split the continents, opening deep, jagged fissures that swallowed entire swaths of ancient forest. High-velocity force storms scoured the surface daily, generating massive strikes of purple lightning that reduced the ancient granite statues to coarse gravel. The planet physically deteriorated under the intense friction of the two opposing energy fields. The populations residing on the settled worlds observed the severe atmospheric degradation of Tython through their high-powered orbital telescopes. The ruling families on Shikakwa and Kalimar positioned their heavily armed sublight freighters in a tight, overlapping blockade around the planet's exosphere. They locked down the navigational choke points within the deep core and fired concentrated thermal artillery bursts at any Tython transport attempting to cross the atmospheric boundary. The settled worlds completely isolated the warring factions, containing the violence and forcing the combatants to rely entirely on the rapidly dwindling physical resources of the crumbling planet. Inside the surviving stone archives of Caleth, the Temple Masters reviewed the physical toll of the decade-long war. They traced the specific biological breakdown and the environmental devastation caused by Dagon Lok's aggressive military campaign. The Masters observed the direct physical correlation between the application of Bogan energy and the rapid cellular consumption of its users. They documented the violent tectonic shifts corresponding directly to the mass clustering of dark side practitioners. The elders identified a fatal structural flaw in their original vows. They determined that attempting to control the Bogan inevitably resulted in total physical and mental destruction. The Masters laid out fresh parchment scrolls on the wooden tables and rewrote the foundational tenets of their order. They committed their followers strictly and permanently to the Ashla, equipping their fighters with the Force-forged swords and preparing to launch a final, concentrated assault to eradicate the Dark Side faction completely. The Temple Masters designated the massive stone ruins of Caleth as the primary staging ground for their offensive. They gathered their remaining forces within the dense, overgrown courtyards of the Archive City. Rangers and journeyers strapped heavy leather braces to their forearms and secured the glowing, force-forged broadswords to their belts. The Masters outlined specific tactical maneuvers on large, flimsy-plast maps spread across the stone tables. They planned a direct, concentrated physical assault on Stav Kesh, the fortified mountain stronghold held by Dagon Lok and the Bogan faction. The objective required a rapid vertical ascent up the steep mountain trails, utilizing coordinated kinetic strikes to breach the heavy granite barricades. High in the northern peaks, Lok anticipated the assault. He directed his forces to reinforce the choke points along the mountain paths. The Bogan followers stacked massive boulders and drove sharpened iron stakes into the freezing mud. They stood on the high battlements of Stav Kesh, their red eyes scanning the lower tree line, gripping their crimson forcesabers tightly. The cold air grew thick with static electricity as hundreds of individuals continuously channeled raw dark side energy. Lok paced the upper courtyard, his breathing shallow and rapid. He observed the deep grey storm clouds swirling directly above the temple, a visible physical reaction to the extreme concentration of Bogan power within the stone walls. The Ashla forces initiated their advance at dawn. They marched in tight formations up the steep, winding trails, their heavy boots slipping in the wet slush and mud. The Temple Masters led the vanguard, projecting a unified passive field of light-side energy to counter the oppressive dark-side static radiating from the peak. As the Tythons reached the lower barricades, the Bogan defenders opened fire. They hurled heavy stones and loosed concentrated bursts of purple lightning from the upper ridges. The Ashlar vanguard raised their hands, using focused kinetic waves to deflect the falling debris and ground the electrical strikes into the wet soil. The physical clash occurred at the primary gates of Stavkesh. The Ashlar forces drew their force-forged swords, the metal blades glowing with a steady, white internal light. They met the crimson force-sabers of the defenders, the opposing weapons colliding with explosive physical force. The heavy impacts sent shockwaves through the air, cracking the stone paving beneath their boots. Seknos Wrath fought at the front of the Bogan line, his heavy musculature augmented by the dark side adrenaline. He swung his red blade in massive arcs, forcing 3 Ashlar Rangers backward down the steep stone steps. Shea Koda and Tasha Rio fought alongside the Temple Masters, executing precise, disciplined strikes to parry the aggressive, wild swings of the Bogan defenders. The air filled with the sharp smell of ozone, melting metal, and burning wool. Dagon Locke descended from the upper battlements, his crimson blade humming loudly. He targeted the Temple Masters directly, utilizing rapid kinetic pushes to separate them from their defensive formations. He drove his heavy boots into their chests and swept his energy blade toward their unarmored limbs. The physical toll of the sustained combat rapidly degraded the stamina of both factions. The combatants slipped on the slick stone, their breathing ragged and their movements slowing under the extreme physical exhaustion. The massive concentration of opposing energy fields at the peak of the mountain triggered a catastrophic environmental failure. The dense grey clouds above Stavkesh ruptured, releasing a localized, hyper-concentrated force storm directly onto the battlefield. Violet and white lightning struck the stone courtyards simultaneously, instantly vaporizing the combatants at the points of impact. High-velocity winds tore through the narrow mountain passes, picking up heavy granite boulders and throwing them through the thick walls of the temple. The ground beneath Stavkesh fractured, opening deep, jagged fissures that swallowed dozens of fighters whole. The physical devastation forced an immediate cessation of combat. The surviving Titans dropped their weapons and scrambled for cover, dragging the wounded into the shallow caves and surviving archways, watching the violent destruction of the green world unfold around them. The surviving Temple Masters led the Ashlar faction through the dense burning forests toward the chasm of the rift. They carried their glowing, force-forged swords, stepping over the charred timber and the deep craters left by the localized lightning strikes. Dagon Locke and the Bogan faction waited on the wide basalt ledge surrounding the subterranean forge, their crimson force-sabers ignited and casting sharp red reflections across the pooling magma below. The two armies converged in the narrow canyon, engaging in massive, continuous kinetic exchanges. The physical combat shattered the remaining geological structures. The combatants swung their heavy blades, severing arms and driving metal hilts into exposed ribs. The extreme concentration of opposing energies generated localized atmospheric implosions, creating loud, concussive shockwaves that burst the eardrums of the fighters and cracked the solid bedrock. During the heaviest fighting, the remaining 9 Thoyor ships activated simultaneously across the continent. The massive dark pyramids vibrated violently, shedding centuries of accumulated rock and ash from their sloped hulls. The blue seams along their edges flared with intense, blinding light. The ships lifted off their stone foundations, hovering hundreds of meters above the ruined temple cities. The Thoyor projected a massive, unified field of raw force energy directly into Tithon's core. The planetary crust fractured completely. Deep fault lines tore across the continents, swallowing the oceans and releasing massive columns of superheated gas into the atmosphere. The heavy gravity fluctuations ripped the warring Tithans from the ground, tossing them physically into the air alongside shattered granite blocks and uprooted trees. The Temple Masters recognized the total structural collapse of the planet. They lowered their weapons and directed their remaining Ashla energy to physically stabilize the surrounding fighters, attempting to shield their bodies from the crushing gravitational pressure. Dagon Locke maintained his aggressive stance, swinging his crimson blade at the falling debris until a massive piece of flying basalt struck him directly in the chest, shattering his ribs and throwing him into the deep chasm. The extreme friction between the Ashla, the Bogan, and the raw power of the Tho-Yor ignited the atmosphere, turning the sky into a solid sheet of white fire. The 9 Tho-Yor ships descended through the burning atmosphere, positioning themselves directly over the scattered groups of surviving Tithans. The dark metal ramps lowered, and the ships physically drew the inhabitants into their interior holding chambers. Shea Koda, Seknos Wrath, and Tasha Rio dragged the wounded Temple Masters up the steep inclines, securing them onto the cold metal resting platforms. The ships sealed their heavy bulkheads, blocking out the intense heat and the deafening roar of the dying planet. Inside the quiet corridors, the Tithans collapsed onto the floor grates, their bodies battered and their energy completely depleted. The ships engaged their hyperdrives, launching vertically through the expanding cloud of planetary debris and jumping into the deep space of the Titan system, leaving the green world to tear itself apart in the vacuum. The Tho-Yor traveled to the outermost edge of the system, stopping their hyperdrives near a small, frozen planet, completely devoid of atmospheric storms or active tectonic plates. This planet, identified later as Ossus, consisted of wide, flat plains of solid ice and deep, silent glacial valleys. The 9 ships descended to the frozen surface, their massive bases melting the ice upon impact. The ramps lowered, and the surviving Tithans stepped out into the freezing, thin air. They pulled their torn cloaks tightly around their shoulders, their heavy boots slipping on the slick ice. They looked up at the unfamiliar night sky, noting the absence of the twin moons, Ashla and Bogan. The raw, violent energy of Tython was gone, replaced by a cold, absolute physical silence. The survivors recognized the complete failure of their previous philosophy. The strict adherence to the center and the subsequent division into absolute light and dark had physically destroyed their homeworld. The Temple Masters and the remaining Bogan fighters dropped their heavy iron blades and their metal force-sabers onto the ice. They stood together in the freezing wind, their physical differences erased by the heavy trauma of the Force Wars. They required a completely new structure, one that abandoned the aggressive military expansion of the Bogan and the rigid isolation of the Ashla. They began gathering loose stones from the glacial valleys to construct new, basic shelters. They focused on simple physical survival, hunting the local fauna and melting ice for drinking water. In this cold, quiet environment, the survivors shed the title of Tithans. They reformed their order, committing to a new, unified path that would eventually spread outward into the wider galaxy, establishing themselves permanently as the Jedi. The initial group of survivors organized a basic encampment on the thick ice plains of Ossus. They used the heavy durasteel bulkheads from the Tho-Yor ships to construct low, wind-resistant shelters. They mapped the immediate geographical features, documenting the deep, frozen riverbeds and the sharp, glacial ridges. The Temple Masters gathered in the center of the camp, shivering in the sub-zero temperatures. They discarded the old, rigid hierarchy that had required a strict division of the Force into Ashla and Bogan. They established a new, pragmatic code based on the immediate realities of physical survival and communal defense. They called this new structure the Jedi Order, dropping the apostrophe from their original name to mark a permanent break from the failed philosophies of Tython. The first Jedi initiated a physical curriculum designed to adapt their bodies to the extreme cold. They marched across the ice plains without their heavy cloaks, forcing their metabolisms to adjust rapidly. They practiced focused breathing exercises to warm the air entering their lungs and utilized localized kinetic pulses to shatter thick ice blocks over the frozen rivers. They did not engage in the aggressive combat drills that defined the Force Wars. Instead, they focused entirely on developing defensive techniques, using their wooden staffs and iron blades to deflect the high-velocity hail and ice shards carried by the strong planetary winds. They learned to sense the subtle shifts in the frozen terrain, anticipating sudden crevasses and unstable snow bridges before they fractured under their boots. Vesh and Trill lived among the newly formed Jedi. The two Force Hounds maintained a low profile, keeping to the outer edges of the encampment. They wore thick furs harvested from the native white-furred predators they tracked through the snowdrifts. They utilized their specific knowledge of Rakatan technology to modify the heating units salvaged from the Thoyor ships, providing stable warmth for the entire colony. The heavy iron collars were gone, leaving distinct circular scars around their necks. The black barcode tattoos on their faces slowly faded over time, blending with their frostbitten skin. They abandoned the violet Force's sabers, recognizing the deep association those weapons held with the Infinite Empire and the subsequent destruction of Tython. Instead, they forged simple iron swords and practiced the defensive forms mandated by the new Jedi Masters. The Order expanded its reach beyond the immediate ice plains. They dispatched small scouting teams in retrofitted transport ships, mapping the adjacent star systems and identifying new, habitable worlds. They encountered scattered populations of refugees who had fled the Despot War and the Rakatan invasion. The Jedi provided these groups with basic medical supplies, food rations, and structural schematics for surviving harsh environments. They did not demand political compliance or enforce strict philosophical dogmas. They offered practical assistance, establishing a reputation as reliable, neutral mediators and capable physical defenders. This approach fostered a deep, functional trust between the Jedi and the developing planetary colonies, laying the groundwork for a broader, cooperative galactic network. The physical separation from Tython forced the Jedi to redefine their relationship with the Force. They recognized that the intense, localized energy of their former homeworld had artificially amplified their abilities and accelerated their physical degradation. On Ossus, the Force manifested as a steady, quiet current, lacking the violent extremes of the Ashla and the Bogan. The Jedi adapted to this new reality, learning to channel the energy smoothly and efficiently. They developed techniques to project localized physical shields to protect the vulnerable refugees from pirate attacks and environmental hazards. They focused on precision and control, using small, calculated physical movements rather than the massive, chaotic energy bursts that characterized the Force Wars. As the decades passed, the ice camps evolved into permanent stone structures. The Jedi utilized advanced architectural designs, incorporating thick thermal insulation and reinforced support beams capable of withstanding heavy snowfall. They established large training courtyards and extensive archive rooms, transferring the surviving physical records from Tython onto durable flimsiplast sheets. The Order codified its new tenets, emphasizing patience, defense, and the physical protection of the innocent. They rejected the aggressive pursuit of power, recognizing the inherent physical danger of losing their internal center. The Jedi Order solidified its position on Ossus, building a lasting foundation based on hard-won physical survival and the quiet, steady flow of the Force. The early Jedi organized their new society on Ossus by establishing clear physical boundaries and assigned roles. They divided the expanding settlement into distinct sectors. The outer perimeter consisted of heavily reinforced guard posts constructed from salvaged durasteel plating. Jedi watchmen stood at these posts, wrapping their faces in thick woolen scarves to block the freezing winds, and scanned the flat ice plains for localized predators or incoming ships. In the center of the camp, laborers operated the massive thermal heating units, loading them with extracted combustible minerals to maintain a steady, functional temperature within the main gathering halls. The agricultural teams worked in the deep glacial valleys, using focused thermal energy to thaw large tracts of soil and cultivating hardy, frost-resistant root vegetables to supplement their hunted meat rations. The Temple Masters, now holding the title of Jedi Masters, utilized a large, low-ceilinged stone hall for their instruction. They required all young students to sit on the cold, hard flagstones during meditation to reinforce their physical endurance. The masters instructed the students to project their senses outward, completely bypassing the aggressive, adrenaline-fueled state associated with the Bogan. They taught the Padawans to feel the slow, methodical shifting of the ice sheets and the quiet, steady rotation of the planet. During combat training, the students practiced with simple wooden staffs in the open courtyards. The masters corrected their physical stances, emphasizing low centers of gravity, minimal movement, and the continuous deflection of incoming kinetic force rather than direct aggressive strikes. Sesh and Trill integrated into the daily physical routines of the settlement. They worked in the centralized forge, utilizing their deep understanding of thermodynamics to regulate the temperature of the smelting fires. They pounded raw iron ingots into flat, wide broadswords, completely discarding the complex internal circuitry required for Force's sabers. The heavy, physical labor built thick calluses on their hands, replacing the smooth skin previously maintained by the automated systems of the Infinite Empire. When they joined the combat drills, they deliberately slowed their reaction times, consciously overriding the rapid, lethal kinetic responses drilled into their muscle memory by the Rakatan overseers. They sparred with the Tython students, trading the sharp hiss of energy blades for the dull, heavy thud of wood striking wood. The Jedi expanded their archive, utilizing the stable, dry environment of Ossus to preserve their physical records. Scribes sat at long wooden tables, transcribing the history of the Force Wars and the specific physical consequences of the Bogan onto fresh, flimsy-plast sheets. They completely banned the documentation of dark side techniques, refusing to record the specific crystal alignment processes or the biological energy extraction methods used by the Rakata. The archive focused exclusively on the precise anatomical charts required for organic healing, the complex astronomical calculations needed for sublight navigation, and the detailed defensive combat forms mandated by the new code. The Jedi organized this knowledge systematically, locking the scrolls inside heavy iron chests to protect them from moisture and physical decay. As the settlement matured into a permanent city, the Jedi finalized the structure of their new order. They required every individual to sever their ties to the specific noble houses and regional affiliations of the Tython system. The members wore simple, unadorned robes woven from coarse brown and tan fibers, completely standardizing their physical appearance. They removed the decorative crests and the specialized armor plating used during the Despot War. The Jedi Masters enforced a strict adherence to a unified, collective identity, prioritizing the survival and stability of the group over individual physical ambition. They stood in the quiet courtyards of Ossus, breathing the freezing air, and committed themselves entirely to the slow, steady study of the Ashla.